Chapter 525. Martin, is your wound okay? Luna walked towards Martin and asked in a worried tone. Martin shook his head. It's been treated and there's no infection. Don't worry. That's good. Luna looked at Martin's wound and sighed in relief. Ian waited for everyone to adjust themselves and said, "Let's go." He took the lead and led the way. Martin, Rosemary, and others followed behind him. Dean looked at Eugene. There was a trace of coldness in his eyes. He was ready to find an opportunity to get rid of Eugene and interrogate him about the mastermind behind the scenes. The mountain was foggy and the air was humid. There was a faint rotten smell and fishy smell. Ian took the lead and walked towards the direction of the fog. His magic marks could control body temperature and sensed the temperature difference in the surrounding air. It could be described as a precise body thermometer. Of course, this was only one of his abilities. It was suitable for camouflage. It's a bit strange, Martin suddenly said after climbing for more than 200 meters. Ian looked back at him. What's wrong? Martin looked at the deep grass and leaves around him and said in a low voice, "Didn't you notice that the density of the fog is a bit too high? It's still the black snow season. The temperature is so low, and there's no sun today. There shouldn't be such a thick fog. There's too much dew on it." Everyone was startled as they heard Martin's words. They noticed that the grass was covered with dew as if it had been washed by heavy rain. However, there was no sign of rain when they came here yesterday. Moreover, the road wasn't wet either. Ian furrowed his brows and remained silent. His many years of hunting experience told him that there must be a reason behind this anomaly. However, the target of the mission was nearby, and they couldn't retreat just because of this. After all, they had already killed the corpse-pecking guards around the Wind Listeners. If they turned back now and the Wind Listeners sensed danger and left this place, it would be even more difficult to find them again. The time and distance they would have to spend would be a form of risk. He thought for a moment and whispered, "Everyone be careful. Be ready to evacuate if there's an abnormal situation." Everyone nodded and became even more vigilant. Dean followed the team and did not dare to relax. After all, this was a wasteland. Pioneers would encounter danger. Although he had life-saving wings, it was difficult to guarantee that he would not be killed by the powerful monsters before he could react. "I smell it." After walking for hundreds of meters, Luna suddenly said. She gently sniffed the tip of her nose as she raised her finger and pointed to a high slope in front of them. "The smell of the Wind Listeners is in front." Ian looked back at her. "Are you sure?" "Yes." Luna nodded seriously. The monster atlas recorded the smell of the Wind Listener. "It's very similar to what I'm smelling now. It should be the Wind Listener." Ian nodded and felt a little relieved. He didn't expect his luck to be so good this time. He found a target as soon as he arrived in the barren area. However, what followed was a dangerous and bitter battle. His expression became a bit more dignified, and he said to everyone, "Get ready to fight. Ruby, put the food here first, in case it's inconvenient to move later." Ruby nodded and put down the huge bag on his back. He stuffed it into the gap between two nearby trees. "Let's go." Ian took the lead and walked forward. Everyone quickly followed him. Soon, they walked out of the woods and saw a piece of flatland in front of them. In front of the flatland was a huge rock, steep and indented. At the intersection of the depression, there was a dark cave. Even Dean, who had an ordinary sense of smell, could smell the stench from the cave. It was mixed with the rotten smell of the damp soil in the swamp and another kind of indescribable strange smell, which was creepy and nauseating. Ian looked at the cave and said in a low voice, "It's here. Prepare the torches." Ruby took out several torches from his backpack. He poured kerosene on them and lit them up. He handed one torch to Ian and Martin. He handed one torch to Eugene. As for Dean, Rosemary, and Luna, they were informed that they had night vision, so they didn't need torches. Ian also had night vision. He picked up the torch and threw it into the cave. Whoosh! The firelight rolled in the air like a wheel, falling straight into the cave. The firelight was imprinted on the edge of the cave, and an extremely disgusting scene could be seen. The walls of the cave were not made of thick rock and soil, but a black cutic-like substance that crawled all over the cave. It looked a little like dried feces, a little like molted hard shells, and more like the rotten flesh of some animals. A strong stench was emitted from the black substance on the cave wall. After the fire flew into the cave, it quickly disappeared. However, everyone looked at the cave warily, as if they were facing a great enemy. They got into formation and prepared for battle. Time passed little by little. 10 minutes passed, but there was still no movement in the cave. Ian frowned. Was it because the depth of the cave was too long that it didn't alarm the silencer? He glanced at the surrounding ground, picked up a stone, and moved a little closer. Then, he threw it inside again. With a bang, the stone hit the rock wall and made a muffled sound. Ian took 2 steps back and returned to the team. He stared at the cave vigilantly. They waited for another 4 or 5 minutes, but there was still no response from the cave. Ian was puzzled as he saw such a strange situation. Martin, Rosemary, Luna, and others looked at each other. It would be much more dangerous if they entered the cave. After all, it was the nest of the silencer. The silencer would be more familiar with the place. Moreover, the environment inside the cave was narrow. It wasn't conducive for them to fight as a team. The open space outside the cave was perfect for them to exert all their strength. However, even with such a huge commotion, the wind listeners didn't react at all, unless it wasn't in the nest. Everyone thought of this possibility at the same time. Ian's eyes flashed, and he whispered, "It might not be in the cave. Prepare to go in with me and set up an ambush. Be careful, in case it hides in the dark of the cave and ambushes us." Although the possibility of a ladder was small, and with the intelligence of the wind listeners, it was still a possibility. Naturally, they had to be on guard. Everyone nodded and slowly followed him to the cave. Luna tightly covered her nose as they got closer. Her keen sense of smell made her face turn green. She had a feeling of suffocation. Dudian looked around, but didn't see any heat reaction. However, the silencer was a cold-blooded monster. It was natural that its thermal vision couldn't detect anything. Suddenly, he saw 2 silver scales on the side of a protruding stone 4 or 5 meters away from the entrance of the cave. The scales were stained with a sticky, silk-like liquid. It exuded a fishy smell. Chapter 5:26. Dean's eyes flashed as he thought of Corpse Pecker. He whispered, "Be careful. There may be intelligent monsters hiding in the cave." Ian and others were shocked when they heard Dean's words. Ruby, who was standing nearby, asked, "Did you see it?" Dean shook his head and pointed to the silver scale. "This isn't the scale of the silencer. There may be other monsters here. Our previous lure didn't alarm it. It means that this thing has evolved to have a high level of intelligence." Ian looked in the direction he was pointing and saw the scales on the ground. He frowned and said in a low voice, "Not bad. Everyone be careful." Eugene laughed and said, "You're overreacting. It's just a piece of scale. It could have been left behind by a monster that the wind listeners hunted. How much intelligence can a monster evolve to? Our bait would have alerted it a long time ago." Martin ignored him and looked at Ian. "Dean's words are reasonable. Be careful." Ian nodded and lowered his body. He held a sword in one hand and a dagger in the other. He slowly moved forward. Eugene's eyebrows twitched as he saw that no one paid attention to him. He knew that he had lost the trust of the people. He chuckled, but didn't care. He leisurely followed Ian and others into the cave. There was a faint breeze as they went deeper into the cave. It was accompanied by a strong smell of rotten corpses and excrement. Dean and others frowned. Luna's face was ugly. She didn't dare to breathe. Her previous superior sense of smell had become her fatal weakness at this moment. The walls of the cave were covered with sticky and smelly liquid. There were also damp excrement and other things. It was extremely filthy. After going 100 meters in, they suddenly saw the bones of some monsters scattered on the ground. There was still fur and flesh that hadn't been completely gnawed on. Ian squatted down and examined them. After seeing the bite marks, his expression turned serious and he said, "This is indeed the lair of the silencers. Be careful." Everyone nodded, slightly in agreement. Ian continued to lead the way. The curvature of the cave was like a dark and thick, oily intestine. Everyone held their breath as they were nervous. They knew that it would be difficult to fight in the nest of the silencer. Moreover, they didn't know if there were other monsters besides the silencer. Dean wanted them to light torches and smoke the entrance of the cave to force the monsters out. But considering the existence of Eugene and other factors, he resisted the proposal. In the blink of an eye, they went 400 or 500 meters in a cave. There weren't any jagged rock spikes on the ground. The walls were smooth, and there were monsters of different sizes everywhere. When they were more than 400 meters deep, they also saw a few zombies whose bodies had been torn apart. Only the head and the ribs were left. They crawled slowly on the ground, making low noises like insects. It was a little scary in this quiet cave. Ian was scared as he saw the undeads. He angrily killed them and continued to move forward. Hey, Ian's pupils shrank as he saw something. He raised his hand to signal Luna, Dean, and others to stop. Their palms were overflowing with cold sweat as they stared at the front. Ian took 2 steps forward and focused his gaze. He immediately saw the face of the terrifying shadow blocking the passage. After looking carefully, he almost cried out in alarm and whispered, "It's the blood cinder." Martin's heart skipped a beat, and he had an awful look on his face. The blood cinder was a rare magical beast, just like the wind listener and the corpse pecker. If he were to encounter the wind listener and the blood cinder at the same time here, it would be an unpredictable and bitter battle. Before he could finish worrying, he heard what Ian said next. "He's dead." Dead? Martin was startled. Luna, Ruby, and others were also startled. Dean's night vision was sensitive. He had already seen the huge wound on the chest of the shadow. The blood had already dried up. It was like it was burned by a blazing flame. The blood and bones had turned into magma and solidified in the wound. Ian swallowed a mouthful of saliva and slowly approached. He stabbed out his saber and penetrated the blood cinder's body that looked like a ferocious starfish. The latter's body shook slightly, as if it had come back to life. Ian immediately sheathed his knife. With a bang, the blood cinder's body fell straight to the ground. Ian was pale. He gently gasped for breath. He tentatively used the tip of his sword to poke the blood cinder's body. Soon he found that the blood cinder was dead. Its body was stiff. It had been dead for a long time. His face changed. Was it an internal strife among the monsters? He hesitated for a moment, but gritted his teeth. "Ruby, find out if the parasitic soul worm is still in its body." Ruby swallowed her saliva. She took out the bottle and went forward. Ian, on the other hand, was observing his surroundings in case there was danger lurking in the dark. After a while, Ruby excitedly shouted, "The parasitic soul worm is still there." Raising the bottle, there was a centipede-like bug imprisoned in the bottle, struggling with all its might, as if it wanted to break the transparent wall. Ian was startled for a moment. He didn't expect that the parasitic soul worm in the blood donor who had died a long time ago would still be alive. It had to be known that after the death of its host, the parasitic soul worm would die if it couldn't find a new host in a short period of time. This usually took between half an hour to 3 hours, but from the rigidity of the blood donor's body, it was clear that the parasitic soul worm was more than 3 hours old. Soon he thought of the special body structure of the blood cinder. It seemed that the parasitic soul worm was one of the few monsters that could survive in the host's body for a long time after the death of the host. He whispered, "Follow me. It's a bit unusual here." Ruby excitedly put away the parasitic soul worm. He held the axe and followed Ian. After walking for hundreds of meters, a corner appeared in front of them. A very slight sound came from the other side of the corner. It seemed to be the sound of sand rubbing on the ground. Ian's eyes narrowed. He made a warning gesture and held his weapon. He lowered his body and slowly sneaked over. Whoosh! As soon as he got close to the corner, he suddenly rushed out, ready to launch a surprise attack. However, the moment he jumped out of the corner, his hand holding the weapon stopped. He stared at the scene in front of him with his eyes wide open. On the ground in the corner, a monster lay dying. Its lower body resembled that of a spider, but it had a huge flesh sac and many sharp, multi-jointed legs. Its upper body resembled that of a hound, with a ferocious canine head and huge ears that did not droop on both sides of its head. Instead, they spread out like hardened scallops. Rather than calling them ears, they looked more like armor that protected its head. The wind listener? Ian was stunned. Martin, Ruby, and the others who quickly followed behind also saw the scene and were stunned to the corner. This strange monster was the wind listener. At the moment, it was lying on the ground weakly. Its lower body was like a spider's meat sack. Its intestines and other things were dragged on the ground for more than 10 meters. Several multi-jointed legs were broken. What was more terrible was that the chin of the dog's head was missing. Only a row of teeth in the upper jaw and the tongue in the throat were hanging weakly on the neck. Dean also saw the dying wind listener with many fatal wounds. He was startled for a moment. Suddenly, he felt a chill from the surrounding cave. He couldn't help but look back at the exit of the cave. His face changed slightly. Ian had already recovered from his shock. He immediately rushed forward and swung his saber at the wind listener's broken jaw. He instantly chopped off the wind listener's drooping tongue along with his head. Blood spurted out. Ian stepped back to avoid the blood rain. He looked at the wind listener who had completely fallen. He was relieved and turned to Ruby. "Come and collect the parasitic soul worm." "Okay." Ruby's eyes lit up. He immediately rushed up. Ian shook off the bloodstains on his saber and exhaled softly. Chapter 5:27. We've carried out so many missions, but this is the first time we've encountered such a thing. Ha! Ruby laughed. It's not that simple. Martin squatted beside the silencer's body and carefully looked at it. He frowned and whispered. This silencer's wound was fatal. It's the weakest part of its body. It doesn't look like it was caused by the blood sender. Ian looked at Martin. What do you mean? Martin used the dagger to pick up the wound on the silencer's flesh sac and jaw and said, "Look, these two wounds aren't caused by the blood sender's tentacles. Aside from these two wounds, the rest of the body is perfectly fine." Ian focused his gaze, and he was instantly moved. "You're saying..." "Yes." Martin slowly got up. His eyes were gloomy as he slowly swept over everyone's face. If my guess is correct, it should have been killed by another monster. Moreover, it should have been killed by an overwhelming force. It didn't even have the strength to fight back. Luna and Ruby suddenly froze. Rosemary's eyes slightly widened. "You mean there are other monsters in this nest?" Martin looked at her and shook his head. "I'm not sure if that thing is still here, but this silencer should have been killed by a higher-level monster." Luna gulped. "A higher-level monster? A monster that can overwhelm and kill the silencer without being detected. Is it a higher-level monster from the Red Wasteland?" Martin's face was gloomy. He didn't answer her, but looked at Ian. Ian didn't hesitate as he decisively said, "Take out the parasitic soul worm and leave this place." Ruby didn't dare to delay. He quickly found the parasitic soul worm in the silencer's body. It looked like a small spider. Its whole body was stained with the silencer's blood. It was constantly struggling when it was put into the bottle. Ruby had just twisted the bottle cap when suddenly a loud bang came from outside the cave. The ground slightly trembled. Everyone's complexion changed. Ian suddenly looked at the direction of the cave exit. His face was pale and ugly. Boom! There was another loud sound. It seemed to be the footsteps of some giant creature, and it was approaching the nest. Dean felt the tremor under his feet. His face was gloomy. From this violent movement, he could imagine how huge this thing was. Although the size could not absolutely determine the strength of a monster, but in most cases, the large size of the monster was often of a high level. Is that thing back? Ruby's dark face was also a little pale. The strong shaking caused by the footsteps had already instinctively formed a huge and terrifying outline in his mind. Ian came back to his senses, hesitated for a moment, and immediately said, "Run inside, hide in the innermost part." If this was the demonic creature that had killed the wind listeners, then there was no doubt that their team would have no chance of winning against it. After all, even if they encountered the wind listeners, they would have to put up a bitter fight. However, the wind listeners had been easily killed by the demonic creature. This kind of power could easily annihilate their team. They could only hide. Moreover, their task had been completed. They had obtained the parasitic soul worm of the wind listeners. Now they only needed to think about how to survive and return to the giant wall. Martin, Luna, Rosemary, and others didn't doubt Ian's order. They immediately followed behind Ian and crossed the corpse of the wind listeners. They rushed into the cave. Eugene glanced at Dean and also followed. He didn't dare to fall behind. Dean looked back at the direction of the cave exit. It was estimated that the rock wall was too thick, so his thermal vision couldn't see the heat of the thing outside the cave. After all, the penetration of vision was limited. Dean's face was gloomy. He didn't expect to encounter such a thing in his first mission. Accidents could happen at any time in the wasteland. He followed Ian and others into the cave. Although his instinct told him that this was not a good idea, but he couldn't think of any better idea. Soon, everyone moved forward. As they went deeper into the cave, they saw more and more monster skeletons on the ground. Rotten pulp and feces could be seen everywhere. Apparently, the monster didn't have the concept of cleaning. Boom, boom. The roar outside the nest was getting farther away, but it was still clear. After running for several hundred meters, Ian, who was at the very front, suddenly stopped. Everyone looked up and saw that there was no way out. In front of them was a dead end. Obviously, this was the deepest part of the nest. Damn it, Ian punched the rock wall. His face was full of anger. Boom, boom. The trembling sound slowly approached from outside the nest. The surrounding rock wall slightly trembled. Sand fell down. It seemed that the thing was squeezing into the cave. Could it be that it noticed us? Ruby said in a trembling voice. If this was the deepest part of the cave, and they didn't see any other living creature along the way, then it was obvious that it was aware of them. Otherwise, there was no reason for it to continue to follow them. Ian, Martin, and others' faces turned ugly. If they were targeted by such a thing, then it would be very difficult to escape. Moreover, they would have to pay an extremely heavy price. Everyone's mood was incomparably heavy. The atmosphere was so heavy that they couldn't breathe. Dean also knew that he had encountered a life-threatening crisis. His heart was pounding, and the blood in his body was flowing fast, as if it was about to burn. There was an instinctive sense of restlessness, but he quickly suppressed this anxious feeling and calmed down. His eyes swept around, and his pupils shrank into a small, making the white of his eyes too big, looking a bit strange and scary. Dean suddenly saw a weak source of heat in the ground under his feet. He suddenly thought of a possibility and immediately said, "There should be a nest under our feet. Let's dig down immediately." What? Ian and others were surprised. Dean said in a hurry, "Dig the passage if you don't want to die. It should be the second nest of the silencers." Ian recovered as he saw Dean's urgent look. Although he didn't have time to think about the reason, but there was no other way. Listen to little Dean. Hurry up. Everyone immediately took out the pickaxes from their backpacks. The pickaxes were made of metal and didn't have wooden handles. Therefore, they were able to exert their strength to a great extent. Dean explained to everyone, "There's no sign of the silencers living nearby. There must be some other purpose for it to dig so deep. My thermal vision has detected a weak source of heat. If I'm not wrong, then it's likely to be an egg. Is there a heat source below?" Ian and others' eyes lit up as they heard Dudian's words. They worked harder to dig the soil. Bang! In less than half a minute, everyone worked together to dig a huge pit. As Ruby used all his strength to hoe, the soil under his feet suddenly collapsed, and everyone fell into it. They fell 7 or 8 meters to the ground. They didn't care about the pain as they quickly turned over and climbed up. They vigilantly looked around. However, when his palm hit the ground, it felt extremely sticky. It was like countless mucus, but the viscosity of this mucus was far higher than mucus. It was even stickier than glue. Dean got up and quickly looked around. He saw countless white eggs in the dark and empty nest. There were several towering pillars in the nest. There were a lot of sticky filaments wrapped around them. The white eggs were slightly contracting as if they were beating. They exuded a faint fishy smell like swill. Dean was relieved. His guess was right. This was the real nest of the silencers. Chapter 528. There's actually another nest here. Ian stared blankly at the oval-shaped white eggs that stood silently around him. Ruby gulped down a mouthful of saliva and said, "This wouldn't be the silencer's ovaries, right? Are these the eggs of the wind listeners that haven't hatched yet?" Luna and Rosemary's eyes lit up as soon as they heard his words. There was a hint of greed in their eyes. If these were the eggs of the silencers, then it meant that they were the offspring of rare monsters. As long as they hatched and entered the growth stage, they would be able to kill them and take out their parasitic soul worms. Looking at the number of eggs around them, there were at least dozens of them. This was simply a windfall. Boom! Suddenly, a violent rumbling sound came from the cave above them, pulling everyone's thoughts back to reality. Before anyone could react, they heard a furious roar, loud and clear to the extreme, like a thunderclap exploding out. Amidst this roar, the entire lair trembled slightly, and the black substance on the rock walls began to fall off. Ian and others' faces turned pale as they looked up. They saw a lot of dust falling from the hole they had dug. It seemed that the cave would collapse at any time. "Quick, find an exit," Ian said quickly. Dean shook his head. "It's useless. There's no way out. It's closed." Ruby, Luna, and others were startled. They looked at him in puzzlement. There was a trace of fear in their eyes. It seemed that they were afraid of what Dean had said. Dean wryly smiled. "There's no wind around." "Captain, didn't you feel that the temperature here is very high?" "It's much higher than the surface. If I'm not wrong, then the environment here is constructed according to the environment of the ovaries. To incubate these eggs requires a higher temperature. Therefore, the wind listeners have completely sealed this place. Even if there is a passage, it will be closed. It will need to be dug, and the passage will only connect to the cave above." Everyone reacted after hearing his words. The abnormal temperature and the stuffy air were indeed, as Dudian said. There was no breeze. Luna couldn't help but ask, "Then, what should we do? Are we just going to wait for death here? That thing will enter the cave soon and find this place. Won't we be walking right into a trap?" Ian's expression changed. He gritted his teeth and said, "Now that things have come to this, we can only fight with our lives on the line. Immediately set up the traps and prepare for battle. If we find an opportunity, we will rush out. Ruby and Eugene, you two look for the exit first. Maybe there are other exits." Ruby and Eugene nodded. They held their torches high and walked along the gap between the white eggs. After a while, the two returned to the front of the team. Ruby said bitterly, "There's really no exit. There are rock walls everywhere." Hearing this, the expressions of Ian and the others who held onto their last trace of hope dimmed, and they were slightly disappointed. However, they were prepared beforehand, so they weren't too disappointed. Ian and Martin quickly composed themselves and continued to prepare the traps in their hands. There were poison nets made of special materials, hidden arrow cartridges, and other trap materials that were easy to carry with them. They were placed in the shadows below the hole. A moment later, the trap was completed. Ian took a deep breath and took a few steps back. He hid near a white egg and whispered, "Prepare to ambush." Everyone held their breath and waited. After a few minutes, Martin suddenly said in a low voice, "There seems to be no movement from above for a long time." Ian was startled for a moment. He suddenly remembered that since the previous roar, the movement from above had gradually stopped. Did that thing give up on chasing them? Luna, who was hiding behind another white egg, whispered, "Is it because its body is too big that it is stuck in the cave and can't get in?" "It's possible." Ian's eyes slightly flashed as he recalled the previous roar. He shook his head. "It should still be in the cave. It hasn't left yet." Everyone naturally knew this. If it had left, the loud footsteps would have gradually faded away, but in reality, it did not. Instead, it had stopped. Obviously, after that thing couldn't squeeze into the cave anymore, it seemed to be preparing to wait for a hare. After squatting for a while, Eugene was the first to stand up. He gasped and said, "It's too hot here. Since it can't come in, should we go up and wait?" Ian frowned and immediately said, Keep your voice down. Don't disturb it. This kind of thing has a big appetite and generally doesn't have much patience. It will leave soon. Don't act rashly. Eugene shrugged his shoulders but didn't say anything. Gradually, everyone came out of their hiding places. They looked as if they had just been fished out of the water. Their messy hair drooped over their hard skulls. Only Ian was not sweating at all, and his body temperature was normal. Are we going to wait like this? Ruby asked. Ian nodded. Wait until it leaves. Seeing that there was no other way, everyone didn't say anything. They just looked for a clean place to sit down and rest. However, there was not a single clean spot in the lair. The ground was covered in a sticky substance that looked like feces, but also like the mucus secreted by monsters. Some of them looked like molted soft skin that hung together and emitted a thick stench like mud. In the hot and sultry temperature, the stench spread to the extreme. Luna covered her nose. Her face was pale. Her body was soft, as if she would faint at any time. Ian, Martin, and others were worried as they saw that her situation was not good. Ian fanned Luna and said, "Drink some water. Calm down." Luna weakly nodded. She took out some water from her backpack and drank some. Her face was slightly better, but it didn't take long for her body to sweat. Her face was very pale as she sat on the ground. Martin frowned and said, "We can't go on like this. The smell here is too strong. Let's let Luna go up first. Let her stay here." Ian looked at Luna, who would faint at any time. He hesitated for a moment and nodded. Everyone worked together to send Luna out of the hole. Luna was lying on the top of the hole, gasping for the fresh air outside. She felt a little better now. Dean was secretly glad as he saw Luna's appearance. Fortunately, he had replaced the magic marks of the defiler in time. An overly sensitive sense of smell was good at times, but its weakness was very obvious. Although Luna wasn't a noble lady and could tolerate some unpleasant smells, but it wasn't a matter of tolerance. It was a physiological reaction of the body, just like some people would vomit when they smelled certain smells. Among the 5 senses of the human body, smell was the one that stimulated the nerves the most. Excessive stimulation of the nerves would lead to the body being unable to bear it. It was normal for the body to faint. "Let's spread out. Don't stick together," Ian said to the rest. Everyone sat in a slightly spaced position and waited in silence. The nest was completely silent. Only the white eggs that were bouncing gently could be heard. 1 hour, 2 hours, more than 10 hours passed in the blink of an eye. There was still no movement from the top of the cave. It made people suspect that the thing had left, but they still didn't dare to act rashly because it was very likely that the thing was sleeping there. 5 days passed in the blink of an eye. In the nest, everyone's expressions were ugly. Although they had already gotten used to this stuffy and oddly smelly environment after 5 days, they didn't expect that the thing that had caused such a huge commotion would actually wait outside for so long. According to Ian's initial deduction, the thing should have left in less than a day. But now, 5 days had passed, and there was still no movement outside. "The temperature here is too high. Our food is going to spoil." Rosemary took out water and drank a little. She only wet her lips and put it away. She said to Ian, "We will starve to death here if we continue like this." Although they didn't consume any physical strength during the wait, but the basic needs were still very high. Although their food was sealed and waterproof, but it couldn't withstand the high temperature. Ian's face was gloomy, but he didn't say a word. Rosemary saw that he didn't have a plan. She sighed and turned to look at Ruby. Ruby had thrown away the bag of food before entering the cave. Now they could only rely on the food in their backpacks to survive. The food was only enough for them to live frugally for half a month. Although they wouldn't starve to death after half a month, but in the state of empty stomach, all aspects of the body would naturally decline, including reaction. "I don't think it's a good idea to continue to wait." Dean glanced at the people sitting around the cave. When he saw that the time was almost right, his eyes flashed and he whispered, "If that thing falls asleep, it will sleep for half a month. We won't be able to hold on for so long. What do you think we should do?" Martin squinted at Dudian. Although Dudian's previous performance was good, he was a little irritated after staying here for 5 days in a row. Chapter 529. Go up and check the situation. Who will go? Who will be willing to go? Ian, Martin, and the others were slightly stunned and frowned. Eugene's face changed as he felt Dean's gaze. Why are you looking at me like that? It means that I propose you to go, Dean said straightforwardly. Eugene's mouth twitched. You are the one who proposed this. Of course you will go. What do you mean by asking me to go? Are you trying to frame me? Dean calmly said. You have retreated in the previous battle. This is your chance to atone for your sins. Moreover, my ability is biased toward perception. You're good at fighting and flexible. You can come back in time if there is an accident. I have no enmity with you. So why would I frame you? This is based on the current situation. Everyone has to contribute to the team, right? Eugene's face was full of anger, but his eyes were cold. He glanced at Ian, Martin, Rosemary, and others. The killing intent in his heart grew stronger as he saw that they didn't say anything. You said that you have the perception ability. I propose that you go. You don't need to get close to it. You can see if that thing is left or is sleeping. Eugene clenched his fists as he said in a cold tone. He didn't follow Dean's words because Dean's words were too watertight. If he was replaced by someone else, then he would be led by the nose by Dean's words. After all, Martin and Ian were the strongest in the team when it came to flexibility. But he couldn't mention them. Once he did, it would be tantamount to losing their votes, and he would be pushed to the opposite side. Dean calmly said, My perception is limited to the heat source. The thing can quietly get close to the wind listener's nest and kill them. I don't need to think about it to know that it is a cold-blooded monster. My perception is useless against it. Eugene stared straight at him. Suddenly, his eyes flashed, and he said angrily, You clearly want to harm me. Just because I stopped you from playing with that little girl last time, you've been holding a grudge against me? Dean was startled. Ian, Martin, and the others' eyes flashed, and they frowned. Dean immediately reacted. He was deliberately making up words to tell others that the purpose of his proposal was not pure. He had ulterior motives so that the possibility of others agreeing would be reduced. You still have the cheek to mention the little girl from last time? Dean got up and stared at Eugene in anger. Eugene, Ian, and others were scared. They thought that Dean was going to use force. Dean said in an angry tone, Are you still a human? That little girl wasn't even half your height, and she wasn't even 7 or 8 years old. Yet you could do such a disgusting thing. And now you're even biting back at me. Yes, I admit that I don't like you because of that matter, and I have some thoughts about you. But this time, my suggestion is only out of consideration for the current situation. Eugene was stunned as he looked at Dean's angry face. If he didn't know that he was just making up such a thing and they didn't know each other before then, he would have believed Dean. He was shocked as he thought about this point. He noticed that Ian and others were looking at him with contempt, especially Rosemary. Her eyes were full of disgust. His heart was half cold. He thought that Dean would deny and defend himself after making up this matter. He had prepared the follow-up words to make Dean's denial and defense look pale and false. But he didn't expect Dean to directly admit it. Moreover, he was making up a counter-accusation. Ruthless. Very ruthless. His face was ugly as he stared at Dean. He clenched his fists. Dean was also staring at him. His chest was violently heaving up and down. It seemed that he was enduring great anger. I agree, Rosemary said. Eugene didn't contribute in the last battle. This time we can go and check the situation. That thing hasn't moved for a long time. Most likely it is sleeping. There shouldn't be any danger. Eugene almost vomited blood as he heard her words. No danger? Then why don't you go? Martin took a deep look at Dean and glanced at Eugene. I also agree. We can't continue to wait like this. I recommend Eugene to be the most suitable person to go up. Eugene almost choked out blood. Recommend? What kind of good thing is this? Do I need your recommendation? Ian looked at Eugene. Since everyone has agreed, then you can go up and check. We will support you in time if there is any danger. Yes, Ruby said in a loud voice. What are you afraid of? What Little Deuce said makes sense. That thing is probably asleep. Maybe it left quietly, but we didn't notice it. You just need to take a look at the situation from a distance. What's there to be afraid of? Eugene's cheeks turned purple. There is nothing to be afraid of. Then why don't you go? Ruby rolled his eyes and said, "Look at my build. Do I look like someone who can run fast?" Puff. Eugene was so angry that he almost fainted. He looked around at the crowd. He knew that the situation was hopeless. No matter how hard he tried, they wouldn't let Dean or Ruby go. After all, Ruby was an old member of their team. Dean was a perceptive type, so he was indispensable. Eugene was a combat type, but Martin and Ian were there, so they wouldn't pay too much attention to him. Thinking of this, the anger on his face suddenly disappeared. He stared at Dean coldly and said, "I wanted to observe you more, but since you are courting death, I will fulfill your wish." Dean's eyes flashed when he heard this. Ian, Martin, and others heard Eugene's words. Ian immediately said, "Eugene, don't be impulsive." "What do you mean? Do you want to kill each other?" Martin narrowed his eyes as he stared at Eugene. Ruby and Rosemary also looked at Eugene. They didn't want to help Dean, but they hated people like Eugene. "Oh." Eugene's mouth slightly twitched as he looked at everyone's reaction. He pulled out a smile, but there was no smile in his eyes. "Do you really think that I am a soft persimmon?" "Ian, Martin, you better not intervene. This is between me and the kid." Ian frowned. "I don't care what personal grudges you have, but no infighting is allowed in the execution of the task." Eugene chuckled and said, "You're right, so I'm going to carry out my mission. Your task?" Chapter 530. Her Highness Hathaway. Ian and others were stunned as they looked at Eugene. They didn't expect that Eugene's backer would be the sister of the Saintess. Ian was startled for a moment and turned to look at Dean. Dean was able to provoke Her Highness Hathaway and was still alive. It seemed that he wasn't a simple nobody. Dean's eyes lit up as he heard Eugene's words. He thought that Eugene was sent by Haisha's supporters to assassinate him, but it didn't seem like it. After all, there were many opportunities to assassinate him, especially when he was fighting with the Pecker. However, Eugene didn't act. Now it seemed that Hathaway sent Eugene because she wanted to know more about him. It also showed that she wanted to use him as a chess piece again. You still don't want to give up after getting the Saintess identity. Dean's eyes narrowed as killing intent rose in his heart. He glanced at Ian and others and saw their expressions. He slowly said, "Captain, this is our private matter. I hope you won't intervene. If he dies, then just report to the higher-ups that he was killed by the monster." Ian, Martin, and others were startled as they saw Dean's murderous look. They knew that the battle couldn't be stopped. Ian knew the purpose of Dean's words. He was worried that they would help Eugene because of the existence of Her Highness Hathaway. But how could they do such a stupid thing? He didn't need to think about it to know that the person who offended Her Highness Hathaway must have a powerful force behind him. The ordinary dragon guards couldn't afford to provoke such a person. Ian hoped that both of them would perish together if necessary. It would be best if both of them died here, so that they wouldn't have to explain it to anyone when they go back. But at the moment, there was a monster sleeping above. If the two of them fought too much and alarmed the monster, then everyone would be in danger. Ian whispered after hesitating for a while, "Why don't you wait for the monster to leave? If we startle it, we'll all die." Eugene sneered, "No, there won't be any movement if we deal with it." After that, the muscles of his whole body slightly swelled, and the outline of golden scales faintly appeared under the cheekbones of his cheeks. This was the characteristic of releasing the full power of the magic mark. Ian was stunned when he saw the change in Eugene. His expression changed slightly. He was extremely sensitive to temperature. Although he didn't have thermal vision, he could still feel the obvious change in the temperature of Eugene's body. It had suddenly increased by several degrees. This had exceeded the temperature of a normal human body. If it was an ordinary person, such a high temperature would have already caused them to die. Dean had the most intuitive feeling. He clearly saw that the heat in Eugene's body was boiling rapidly. It was several times stronger than the heat in the bodies of all the people present, including Martin. Eugene's heat concentration was faintly approaching the level of a pioneer. He was not surprised. Instead, he let out a sigh of relief. Fortunately, Hathaway was not too crazy to send a pioneer here to observe him. In that case, he would not have the confidence to fight with her. However, it made sense. Even in the dragon tribe, where masters were as numerous as clouds, pioneers were very rare. Most of them were in high positions. How could they waste time to observe a small chess piece like him? Martin noticed the change in Ian's expression and looked at him. Ian gave him a wink. Martin was startled for a moment. There was a trace of deep fear in his eyes. He looked at Eugene with a dignified face. He quietly clenched the sword in his hand. He had a hunch that after Eugene killed Dean, he wouldn't leave them alive. Luna, Rosemary, Ruby, and others saw the eyes of Ian and Martin. They suddenly realized what was going on. They were secretly on alert. In the hot and stuffy sealed nest, the atmosphere was tense and murderous. Numerous white eggs were beating gently. They were like eyeballs that were quietly observing the civil war between the invaders. Eugene smiled and looked at Dean. You should have seen it with your thermal vision. You seemed to be very arrogant before. You want to go back and report that I was killed by a monster? Oh, now I will give you a chance to pledge allegiance to Her Royal Highness Hathaway. If you go back, you will meet with Her Royal Highness and listen to her punishment. How about it? Dean's heart moved. He controlled his face to show an ugly expression. He even forced out a little cold sweat. He couldn't help but slightly clench his fists. It seemed that he wanted to retreat, but couldn't take a step. He gloomily said, I'm loyal to the Saintess Hathaway. If you hurt me, the Saintess won't let you go. Eugene sneered. Didn't you vow to kill me before? Why are you so scared now? At the same time, he slowly walked towards Dean. Dean saw that Eugene was slowly approaching him. He slowly took a step back and pulled out his bow. He used the characteristics of an archer to take the lead, and at the same time, retreated to increase the distance between them. Eugene sneered. He took a step forward and avoided Dean's arrow. He instantly approached Dean, who was retreating. The nest was not spacious because of the white eggs. Dean's archer skills couldn't be used in such an environment. This was one of the reasons why Eugene was disdainful. It's over. Despicable boy. Eugene raised his sword as he looked down at Dean and slashed down. The ugly expression on Dean's face disappeared. He calmly looked at Eugene. There was even a hint of a smile on his face. This wisp of danger that suddenly appeared caused Eugene's heart to jerk, and he was slightly stunned. Bang! Dean instantly punched out. The fist was like a black cannonball as it hit Eugene's chest. Dragon armor instantly caved in. There was a faint sound of bones breaking. The heavy force made Eugene's body lose balance. He fell back and naturally lost his strength. Although his posture didn't change, Dean easily dodged the attack. Tap! Tap! Eugene retreated 3 steps. He saw Dean was about to pounce. He hurriedly jumped back and pulled away more than 10 meters away from Dean. His face was a bit ugly. He even broke out in cold sweat. At the same time, he felt a bit angry. As a swordsman, he took the initiative to pull away from an archer. It was a shame. However, he didn't care about it at this moment. What really annoyed him was that he was once again fooled by Dean. Dean quietly stood in place and once again held the bow and arrow. He aimed at Eugene, but didn't shoot. It seemed that he was looking for Eugene's flaws. Eugene didn't dare to act rashly. He was ready to cut the arrow at any time. Then he would step forward when Dean shot another arrow. He was careless before and was hit by Dean. In any case, Dean was an archer. His archery skills showed that he had studied archery for a long time. Naturally, his melee combat ability would be relatively weak. Both of them confronted each other. The atmosphere was dignified. Time seemed to stop flowing. 2 or 3 minutes passed in a blink of an eye. Eugene gently gasped. The pain from his chest made him angry. But he had calmed down. His body instinctively reacted faster when he was punched. Eugene panted softly. The pain in his chest made him angry, but he had already calmed down. The moment he was hit, his body's instinctive reaction was faster. He gathered his strength to protect his chest in time, or else he would have been more seriously injured. Eugene gently gasped. The pain in his chest made him angry, but he had calmed down. His body's instinctive reaction was faster when he was hit by Dean's punch. Otherwise, his injuries would be more serious. At least he could judge that although there was a gap between him and the youth, the gap wasn't big. Fortunately, the surrounding environment helped him. In this narrow environment, Dean would have to fight him in close combat. Eugene was startled. He felt a trace of anger. He was cheated again. Dean didn't shoot the arrow. It was clear that he wanted to consume his energy and physical strength. He didn't want to shoot the arrow, but in such a confrontation, he needed to maintain his peak state at all times. Otherwise, the brute force of Dean's punch was enough to make him unable to dodge. Damn! Eugene cursed in his heart. He took the lead to attack. The longer the stalemate, the more he would suffer. Dean decisively shot the arrow as he saw Eugene pounce on him. Whoosh! As the arrow flew past, Eugene quickly brandished his sword and blocked it. Dean didn't think as he shot the arrow. He stared at Eugene and pulled out an arrow. Bang! He stabbed the arrow towards Eugene's face at the same time as he waved his sword. Eugene's body slid like a fish as he dodged Dean's arrow and cut towards Dean. Dean saw Eugene's movement and thought of the dragon's thorns that he had read before. Suddenly, an idea flashed through his mind. He crouched and kicked at Eugene's crotch while dodging the saber. Eugene's face changed as he jumped back a few steps. He looked at Dean in anger. Despicable boy, do you only know these dirty tricks? It's a good move if I can win, Dean indifferently said. Eugene was angry, but his heart was exceptionally calm. He was acting to make Dean think that he was in a state of anger. Insidious boy, your hidden strength has been exposed. I admit that you're almost the same as me in terms of physique, but you're still dead. Your bow and arrows are only for primary limitless, so you can't use your full strength. But I have a sword. Dean narrowed his eyes. I have one too. Where? In your hand. Eugene was so angry that he laughed. Then I'll give it to you, he roared as he rushed out. His figure moved in a straight line as he stabbed out with his sword. The sword slightly vibrated as it stabbed out. This subtle vibration was extremely important as it would confuse the opponent's judgment. Dean's muscles contracted as his pupils shrank to the extreme. Although he was still a senior hunter and his strength was around level 45, which was equivalent to a primary limitless expert. But he didn't know why he felt his blood boiling. It was as if his heart was longing for such a battle. He even had the desire to devour the opponent. Whoosh! The moment the saber stabbed at him, he suddenly retreated a few steps. His body swayed as he dodged the saber. Don't run away. Eugene grinned. Didn't you want the sword? I'll give it to you. Dean twisted his body and dodged the knife. At the same time, he jumped 7 or 8 meters away like a wolf. He arrived at Eugene's previous position and exchanged positions with him. Ian, Martin, and others were shocked. They didn't expect the two newcomers to be so strong. Eugene's speed and reaction speed seemed to be faster and more sensitive than Dean's. Whoosh! Eugene rushed towards Dean again. Dean stared at him as he quickly crawled. His posture was extremely strange. It didn't look like a human's posture at all. But at this moment, Dean didn't care about the posture. There was only battle in his mind, and there were only two things in the battle: dodge and attack. He was looking for flaws in his attack. His body instinctively dodged. Eugene's wonderful movements and the tricky angle of the sword fell into Dean's eyes. He didn't have time to think about the layout like before. He just instinctively dodged. At the same time, there was a wonderful feeling in his heart. It was like a hunter's excitement and thirst for blood before hunting. Whoosh! Dean's body swayed as he once again dodged Eugene's attack. So fast. When his body crawled to the other side, the rapidly changing scenery around him made him have such a thought. He suddenly became a little excited. The magic mark on his chest seemed to be gently twisting, giving him a wonderful feeling. Do you only know how to dodge? Eugene was a bit surprised as he felt that his speed had slowed down or Dean's speed had increased. Did Dean's physique grow at an astonishing rate in just a few breaths of time? It was impossible. There was a trace of fear in his heart. He pretended to be angry as he roared. As he roared and rushed over, a signal flashed in Dean's mind. Kill! He didn't think as his body suddenly pounced forward. There was a trace of joy in Eugene's eyes as he saw Dean pouncing towards him. He knew that Dean had fallen into his trap. He roared and swung his sword. He used the most destructive fighting stance in the Dragon Blade chapter. Dragon God Slash. The sword was powerful and could exert 200% of its power, but it was doomed to not have too many curves and techniques. Dean's eyes narrowed as his body twisted strangely. It seemed that in addition to his hands and feet, there were several invisible limbs around his body that were assisting him. He passed by the sword and stretched out his palm. His nails soared a lot as he stretched out his palm. His nails sank deep into the flesh of Eugene's wrist. "Take off!" Dean roared in his heart. Chapter 531. Eugene's pupils shrank, and his face was full of shock. He hurriedly used his other hand to grab the saber in his broken hand. Dean mercilessly held his broken wrist and waved the sword. He used the broken wrist as the hilt. The sharp blade cut towards Dean's palm. Eugene was scared and retracted his hand. Dean took the opportunity to retreat and widen the distance. The fierce battle was over. Dean coldly stared at Eugene. He grabbed the hilt of the sword and pulled out the severed hand. He threw on the ground. He didn't dare to continue to attack, as he didn't want to let go of the sword. This life-or-death confrontation caused Ian and the others to break out in a cold sweat. They felt a shiver run down their spines. They knew that if they were to fight against either side, they would have most likely been defeated or even killed. Eugene's face was ugly. He held his broken hand to stop the bleeding. He didn't want to waste any more of his strength. The severe pain made him clench his teeth. But there was a trace of fear in his heart. He didn't care about the pain in his arm. He felt like he was falling into an ice cave. All of this happened in a short period of time. Dean's moves were beyond his expectations. He had lost his right hand and weapon. He didn't have the slightest confidence to defeat Dean with his ordinary basic armor. Failure meant death. He would lose everything, including his loved ones and loved ones. Dean looked at Eugene's broken hand. His eyes turned cold. He didn't stay any longer and quickly waved his sword. Eugene stared at him. His left hand had loosened his right hand. Although his right hand didn't have a palm, both of his hands were still open in a defensive posture. Whoosh! 10 meters of distance was crossed in an instant. Dean's sword was aimed at Eugene's chest. Eugene decisively grabbed Dean's wrist. He wanted to take back the weapon. There were 7 or 8 techniques recorded in the Dragon Blade chapter. It was enough to deal with all kinds of situations. As long as he could take back the weapon, then he would have the hope to reverse the situation. Although his left hand wasn't as flexible as his right hand, but due to long-term training, he wouldn't neglect his left hand, so its flexibility wasn't any worse than Dean's. If Dean gave him a chance, he would have asked Ian and others to help him. Unfortunately, Dean's attack was too fast. Eugene couldn't be distracted as he wanted to end the battle in one go. Whoosh! Eugene's eyes flashed with joy as Dean's wrist was caught by Eugene. "It's over," Dean suddenly said. Eugene was startled as he was about to twist Dean's wrist. Before he could react, he suddenly saw Dean raise his other hand. Almost at the same time, when he caught Dean's wrist, Dean raised his other hand and held the sword in his hand. Weapon fight? Puff! Blood bloomed out as the sword flashed. Eugene's body was numb, as if he was electrocuted. He couldn't muster up any strength. Feeling horrified, he let go of Dean's wrist and touched his neck. The hot and viscous liquid covered his fingers. This clear touch caused his heart to violently twitch, followed by boundless fear. He opened his mouth slightly and suddenly wanted to give up all his dignity to beg Dean to let him live and save him. But he saw that Dean had put away the sword and was quietly looking at him. There was no emotion in his eyes, as if he was looking at an ant. The darkness instantly pressed down, and with a bang, Eugene's body fell down. Dean looked at him to confirm that he was dead. He slowly turned around. Although he had his back to Ian and others, but he could see the eyes of Ian and others. He knew what they were thinking. "It's not good to stay here for a long time. We have to leave as soon as possible. I hope everyone can help us by saying that we were attacked by a monster and he was killed by a monster." Ian and others were startled. They looked at each other and quickly communicated. Ian deeply looked at Dean. He slowly suppressed the killing intent in his heart and nodded. "We will." Ian would have led Martin and others to take the opportunity to kill Dean if it wasn't for the fact that Dean wasn't injured and the battle didn't last long. After all, Eugene was one of Her Highness Hathaway's people. Dean killed him, and they were witnesses. They weren't sure whether Dean would kill Eugene in order to hide this matter or not. However, now that Dean had said this and wanted to leave, it was obvious that he didn't want to fight. Martin didn't dare to act rashly. After all, Dean's strength was too strong. Even if the 5 of them attacked together, they would suffer heavy casualties, even if they could kill Dean. "When you going to leave?" Martin asked. Dean looked at him and said calmly, "I'll take a break first. I'll leave when my physical strength is restored. I'll wait and see. If our battle has alarmed the monsters above, I'll die if I go up now." Ian and Martin looked at each other and frowned. Their eyes were a little dignified. After hesitating for a while, they finally gave up the plan to attack. They weren't sure whether Dean was deliberately looking for an excuse to restore his physical strength or not. However, since Dean said it so openly and reasonably, they couldn't oppose it. They couldn't help but feel a little entangled in their hearts. Dean inserted the sword into the ground and took out the food and water from his backpack to eat and drink. There was a trace of excitement and fear in his heart when he recalled the previous battle. The reason why he dared to challenge Eugene, who had reached the peak of senior frontiersman, was mainly because of the intuition passed to him by his body. The intuition told him that the pioneer was dangerous and Eugene could fight with him. Just like the predators in the jungle wouldn't hunt prey that was stronger than themselves. Otherwise, it wouldn't be hunting, it would be called delivering food. I feel like I'm still missing something. Dean recalled the previous battle. Although there was a feeling of release, he always felt that there was something missing in his body, which made his body not flexible enough, and even somewhat awkward. Perhaps if he grew more hands and feet, it would be more natural. Thinking of this, the image of Splitter appeared in his mind. Rich blade-like limbs and a horrible body that twisted like seaweed. His eyes flashed, and he suddenly thought of a point. The magic mark could give the host similar abilities of monsters. From a biological point of view, it was hereditary. At the same time, the magic mark would be activated again to change the body. This was called evolution. So, since he could inherit some of the physical abilities of monsters, could he also inherit the fighting style of monsters? Dean thought of the feeling of fighting in his heart. The more he thought about it, the more he felt that it was so. Before, he always felt that he couldn't display it. But if he imagined that his body had more limbs like Splitter, it seemed that it would be very carefree. The thought of carefree was a signal from his body, just like the brain knew when the stomach was hungry. In other words, the body had such a demand. The parasitic soul worm stayed in Splitter's body for too long. It completely integrated the fighting habits of Splitter and passed it to me. Dean frowned slightly. His body naturally couldn't grow more limbs like Splitter. This would make it difficult for him to stand in the normal human circle inside the giant wall. After all, even a saint like Aisha couldn't have a strange body that didn't look like a human. This would cause panic. He looked down at his hand and gently twisted it thoughtfully. But he found that the bones of his wrist were like a soft body. They were easily twisted to a strange angle. He couldn't help but be startled. He hadn't found that he could do this before. But this time he was forced to use his instinct in the crisis. Instead, his body showed this ability on its own. Although my body hasn't transformed into the shape of Splitter, but I am able to display a fighting state similar to Splitter. It means that my body is changing. Not only am I adapting to the transformation of the magic marks, but the magic marks are also gradually adapting to the transformation of the new host. The characteristics of Splitter and my body are gradually fusing with each other. Duddian pondered. When Dean twisted his arm, Ian and others had been paying attention to him. They saw that his arm could be twisted to a horrible breaking position. Their faces slightly changed. Recalling his previous strange fighting posture, their eyes were full of fear. Hey! Suddenly, there was a sound of surprise. Everyone was surprised. They looked at the source of the sound. They saw Rosemary standing in front of a broken white egg. She pointed to the thing inside the egg and said with a surprised face, "What is this? It doesn't seem to be." Chapter 532. Ian was startled as he heard Ian's words. He got up and looked at Ian. Martin, Ruby, and others also came over. The white egg, which had been cut open by the shock waves of the previous battle, was filled with amniotic fluid. Its color was turbid and extremely viscous, and it slowly flowed out from the broken part. It was about the size of a human infant, and its appearance was extremely strange. It looked like it was a mixture of the limbs of many wild beasts, and its overall shape was like a crawling lizard. It had a long, curled tail, but there were 7 or 8 small legs on its abdomen. There were 2 protruding bone spikes on its back, and there was a small hole in the middle of the bone spikes, which seemed to be used for breathing. Its head was triangular. It was a bit like a snake's head, but it was much bigger than a snake's head. It was covered with delicate scales. Its body was translucent. It seemed that it was still in the incubation state. Dean's eyes narrowed. The body shape of this little beast was very different from the silencer. Although the silencer he saw in the cave was in the mature stage and had changed a lot from the incubation stage, but there were some similarities between it and the silencer. Also, he had seen the wind silencers in the Atlas of Monsters before. The wind silencers were completely different from the little thing in front of him. There was a trace of surprise in Martin's eyes as he saw the appearance of the little monster. He suddenly thought of something and whispered, "It is not a silencer. We are likely to have strayed into another monster's nest." Another monster's nest? Ruby was surprised. Ian stared at the little monster in the white egg. There was an ominous premonition in his heart as he heard Martin's words. Suddenly, he saw the tail of the curled-up little monster move slightly. The movement was very light, as if it was an illusion. But he was very careful and knew that it wasn't an illusion. He immediately raised his hand and motioned everyone to step back. It is still alive. Dean also noticed this. He took a few steps back to keep a distance from Ian and others. He wanted to avoid suspicion and also to guard against a sudden attack. Alive? Luna stared blankly for a moment as she suddenly thought of something. Her eyes lit up as she said, "This thing doesn't seem to be recorded in the Monster Atlas. It is likely to be a new variant monster. If we bring it back, we will certainly get a generous reward." Hearing her words, Ian and the others' hearts thumped, and a glimmer of light flashed in their eyes. Martin was calmer. He said in a low voice, "I think we need to figure out why there are eggs of other monsters at the bottom of the nest of the silencers, and there are so many of them. Obviously, they didn't ovulate in one go, and they don't look like the offspring of the corpse peckers and the blood cinder, unless..." Ian immediately understood. His expression changed slightly as he said, "Could it be that this is the lair of another monster?" Martin nodded with a solemn expression. "That's right. Don't forget about the big guy above us. Our previous speculation might be wrong. It didn't come to hunt the storm listeners. Instead, it had already captured the storm listeners and the blood cinder and imprisoned them in its nest. As for the corpse pecker we encountered at the foot of the mountain, it might have been lucky enough to escape." Ruby, Luna, and Rosemary looked at each other in amazement and disbelief. Luna couldn't help but ask, "According to what you said, isn't the big guy above more terrifying than the wind listener?" Martin's face was gloomy, but he didn't comment. Ruby asked, "According to what you said, why is that thing sleeping up there? Why didn't it come here? We are in its lair. How can it sleep? I also can't figure it out." Martin frowned. Ian thought, maybe there's another possibility. The other monsters have dug another lair at the bottom of the nest of the storm listeners. They're using the nest of the storm listeners to protect their own lair from other monsters. Martin and the others were stunned for a moment before realization dawned on them. "It's possible." Martin nodded. Ruby said, "So, that monster will come here again? If that's the case, then we just have to wait here and wait for it to come back. Then we can kill it and go out through the tunnel it dug. If that's the case, then we don't have to go from the top." Rosemary said. Dean looked at them coldly. He saw that they believed in Ian's speculation. Not necessarily. "Huh?" Ian and others looked over. There was a trace of vigilance in their eyes. Dean directly raised his doubts. How could the deepest part of the silencer nest be above this place if other monsters have sneaked in to bury their eggs? Ian and others were startled as they looked at each other. This Ruby slightly opened his mouth as he wanted to refute, but couldn't say a word. Luna, who was on the side, suddenly said, "Maybe the silencer was aware of this, so it dug its burrow deeper. But before it could dig its nest, it was killed." "Yes, it's possible." Ian nodded. Dean frowned. There were no obvious loopholes in Luna's statement, so he couldn't refute it. However, he couldn't agree with it, as he felt that there was some missing information. Martin looked at Ian. "Let's take out the little monster and find a way to bring it back." Ian nodded slightly and said to Ruby next to him, "Eat all your supplies and empty your luggage." "No problem, but wait a moment." Ruby agreed immediately. He took off his backpack, took out the food inside, and started eating. He had eaten too much food before the mission, and his body had reached saturation. However, he had consumed a lot of energy in the previous battle with the corpse pecker, so he could replenish it again. Only the sound of Ruby chewing food could be heard in the hot cave. Ian and others stood in front of the broken white egg and observed the little monster. Dean stood alone on the other side. He looked around to find any missing information. Suddenly, out of the corner of his eye, he saw that there was a white egg that was slightly tilted at the edge of a group of rather dark white eggs. It was different from the other eggs that were standing straight around it. Dean frowned. He didn't know what was going on, but he instinctively took a few steps forward. He bent down and looked at the egg. He saw that there was a hole on the side of the white egg. The hole was empty. There was no mucus or small monster. It was empty. He was startled for a moment, but reacted. There was a trace of coldness in his heart. He hurriedly shouted, "Everyone be careful, there's..." Chapter 533. Dean looked towards the source of the scream and saw a bloody scene. He saw a lizard-like monster lying on Luna's back. The monster's body was upright, and its whole body was dark green like crocodile skin. Its triangular head was slightly open, and there were sharp teeth inside. There were two protruding blades on both sides of its cheeks. It looked like a pair of pliers. At the moment, the monster was biting the top of Luna's head. Dean's pupils shrank as he saw the familiar appearance of the monster. Ian, Martin, Ruby, and the others, who were standing not far away, heard the scream and turned around to look. They were all shocked to see this terrible scene. Martin and Ian were the first to react. They roared and quickly waved their weapons and rushed over. Puff! The monster didn't wait for the two people to get close to it, as it pierced through Luna's skull. Luna's screams came to an abrupt stop. The next moment, her skull was suddenly opened, revealing the sticky and bloody brain, as well as the slowly squirming blood vessels inside the skull. The lizard-like monster that was lying on Luna's back flicked its tail and pushed Luna towards Ian and Martin. Then it turned around and rushed into the darkness behind them. When it passed a protruding stone pillar, it didn't make any sound. Even the sound of its footsteps disappeared in an instant. Ian caught Luna's body. His face was extremely ugly. With his height, he could see Luna's skull above the bridge of her nose. The bloody scene stimulated his eyeballs and heart. The slightly squirming blood vessels spread all over the brain tissue like sulci. He clenched his teeth and looked up. Martin had chased the monster to the stone pillar. He looked around but didn't find the monster. Ruby and Rosemary were a bit slower, but they had already rushed over. They clenched their weapons and looked around nervously. But they couldn't see anything. Gone? How was it possible? Where did it go? Ruby was emotional as he waved the torch to illuminate the surrounding rock wall. But he didn't see the shadow of the monster. It was as if the previous scene was just an illusion. Dean immediately rushed over. As soon as he approached, Martin, Ruby, and the others looked at him with vigilance and even deeper anger in their eyes. Dean slightly frowned. There are other monsters here. If we want to fight amongst ourselves, then none of us will survive. Let me see the situation. Maybe I can find it. Martin took a deep look at Dean and tilted his head to Ruby. Ruby stepped aside. Dean squatted down and carefully scanned the ground. Suddenly, he found a more wet and sticky trace. He could not help but stare at the trace. Looking in the direction of the trace, he saw that the trace extended to a deeper rock wall. Martin and Rosemary noticed Dean's eyes and suddenly woke up. They looked up along the trace. and their line of sight finally converged on the dome of the deep rock wall, and then the trace stopped. And at the end of the mark, there was nothing on the rock wall. Everyone's expression changed slightly as they nervously looked around. Drip! Suddenly, an extremely soft sound rang out behind them. Dean, Martin, and others turned around in horror. They didn't see the monster appear from behind, but saw a drop of red blood on the ground not far behind them. It seemed to be Luna's blood. Dean's pupils shrank as he looked up. The top of the pitch-black nest was filled with uneven rock walls, but there was no trace of the monster. Martin's face turned ugly as he looked at the teenager. "Can't you find it with your thermal vision?" "I can't find it," Dean replied in a dignified tone. At this time, Ian came over with Luna's body. He stared at Dean. "You seem to know something before the monster attacked." Martin, Ruby, and Rosemary looked at Dean with an unfriendly expression. Dean's face turned cold as he saw their reaction. "I saw an empty egg over there, so I thought that the thing inside might have hatched. I was about to remind you, but she was attacked. What do you want to suspect?" Ian stared at him for a moment and turned to look at Dean's previous position. He saw a tilted egg. He frowned and looked at Ruby. "Didn't you notice the egg when you and Eugene were looking for the exit?" Ruby replied, "I was looking over there. Eugene was looking over there. If I saw the egg, then I would have told everyone." Ian frowned slightly. Of course, he believed Ruby. In that case, either Eugene was too lazy to look for the exit and didn't notice it. After all, Eugene didn't have night vision and needed the help of a torch, but the area illuminated by the torch was very limited in the dark. Or Eugene noticed it, but didn't say it out loud and had other plans. However, now that Eugene was dead, there was no way to ask about the specifics, and there was no need to delve into it. The thing is similar to the little monster inside the egg. Rosemary reminded as she saw the ugly expression on everyone's face. Ian's expression was gloomy. "I know. That one just hatched a while ago. It's much bigger than the other one. It probably hatched a while ago. At the very least, it hatched before we entered this place." Martin clenched his fists as he looked at Luna. "Damn bastard. It has been lurking around here. It dared to attack us in front of so many people." Rosemary frowned and said, "Luna couldn't stand the smell of the egg, so she stood a bit behind us and fell far away. She was defenseless, so she was able to get the egg. From now on, we can't split up anymore. We must leave this place as soon as possible." "Leave?" Martin looked at her. "Do you want Luna to die in vain?" Rosemary was startled. Ian looked at Martin and was silent for a moment. "It can attack Luna successfully. Its strength is extraordinary. Moreover, it is good at hiding. It will be very difficult for us to kill it." Martin was angry. "Are we not going to help her get revenge? There are so many of us. Why should we be afraid of it? If you really want to leave, then leave. Anyway, I will kill it. I have seen its actions. In addition to sneak attacks, it may not be able to defeat any of us. I don't believe that we can't lure it out." Ruby wanted to say something, but hesitated. He thought for a moment and said, "I also agree with Martin. The 5 of us together are more than enough to kill it. We can't let Luna die in vain." Ian frowned as he saw Ruby agree. He sighed and nodded. "All right, let's kill it first." Dean saw that they were going to stay to avenge Luna. He felt that it was funny. "I think we should leave immediately. Even if we kill it, Luna won't be able to resurrect. Instead, it will consume our strength. If one of us is injured, it will be more dangerous on the way back. We might even sacrifice ourselves." Martin glared at him and said, "Shut up. What is a newbie like you know?" Dean's eyebrows rose. Ian didn't want to quarrel at this time. He waved his hand. "Don't talk too much." He looked at Dean. "Luna is one of our team members. She has performed several missions with us. In short, our lives have been saved by her. Of course, we have also saved her. It's the first time for you to perform a mission, so you can't understand it. But I hope you can understand it." Dean had a feeling that he was about to laugh. He suppressed his anger. "I can understand your feelings, but the situation is more complicated than you think. This thing hatched before we entered, and we have been here for 5 days. We have been alone for 5 days. Such flaws are enough for it to attack, but it didn't. What does this mean? It means that it isn't an ordinary monster, but a monster with a certain level of wisdom. The most important thing is that it didn't choose to attack at that time, but it chose to attack now. It is not because of Eugene's death, but because it has grown up. Ian was startled. Dean continued. It has grown to the extent that it thinks that it can hunt us. That's the main reason why it chose to attack now. In the last 5 days, it has been lurking in the dark and observing us. We have been in close contact with it many times, but we didn't notice it. Even if we felt a trace of abnormality, we would deny it. Rosemary and Ruby's face turned ugly. They found that the situation was as Dean had said. They had been in the same room with the unknown monster for the last 5 days. They were in a state of death at any time. The monster didn't attack them. It was obvious that it was observing their every move. Both of them felt their scalp tingle. Cold sweat oozed out of their bodies as they thought of this. Chapter 534. Dean continued. Luna was about 10 meters away from you, and I was about 15 meters away from you. Logically speaking, this thing should have attacked me first. It would be beneficial for it to retreat. But it took the risk to attack Luna, who was closer to you. It means that it had observed the battle between Eugene and me. It didn't think that it would be able to attack me, so it chose Luna. This shows that the intelligence of this thing isn't an ordinary monster. If you really want to avenge Luna, then the only way is to burn down the nest. That way, you can definitely force it out. But if you do that, not only will you lose all the eggs, but the flame will also alarm the big guy above. When that time comes, no one will be able to leave alive. Ian and others were startled as they looked at each other. Dudian's statement was reasonable and they couldn't refute it, especially Rosemary and Ian, who wanted to leave. They were worried about this point, but it wasn't clear. At the moment when Dean raised it, it was like a wake-up call. They realized the seriousness of the matter and knew that they couldn't be emotional here. Martin was silent as he saw Ian looking at him. He knew that it was time for him to express his stance. He looked up and glanced around the dark cave. There was a trace of deep sorrow in his eyes as he whispered, "If you want to leave, then wrap up Luna's body and take it out. I'm afraid that she will become the food of this beast if we leave her here." Ian and Rosemary heaved a sigh of relief when they saw him relent. Ian nodded and said, "Of course." He took out a foldable storage bag from his backpack and covered Luna's body from head to toe. He zipped it up and sealed it. Then he turned to Ruby and said, "Load the small one. We're leaving now." Ruby nodded, carried the empty backpack, and walked to the previous broken egg. It was only a short distance of more than 10 meters, but he suddenly became a little nervous as he walked, as if the monster on both sides of the darkness would rush out at any time. Suddenly, something was placed on his shoulder. Ruby jumped and turned around in fright. Martin walked over with an indifferent expression and said, "I'll accompany you." When Ruby saw that it was him, he breathed a sigh of relief and forced a smile. In his heart, he wanted to say, "Are you trying to scare me to death?" But he felt that it would be too cowardly to say it, so he held back. Soon, the two came to the broken egg. Ruby handed the torch to Martin, shook his backpack, took out the protective gloves inside, and put them on. Just as he was about to take out the little monster in the broken egg, he was stunned when he bent down. Martin urged, "Hurry up." Ruby swallowed a mouthful of saliva and bent his body even lower. He moved his head closer to the broken egg and looked around, but there was nothing inside except the sticky liquid that emitted a strange smell. The little thing that had been sleeping inside was gone. How was that possible? Ruby, somewhat alarmed, straightened up and said to Martin, "Lower the torch." Martin saw his strange expression and was slightly startled. He suddenly realized something and passed the torch to the egg. When he saw the scene inside, his expression changed, and he said, "It's gone? How is this possible?" Dean, Ian, and Rosemary heard their words. They immediately rushed over. Dean looked into the egg and found that in addition to the fishy egg liquid, he did not see the previous little thing. His face changed slightly, and there was a strange feeling of horror in his heart. Rosemary stared blankly at the egg and said, "Could it be that this thing can move in that form?" Ian was startled for a moment. His face suddenly became pale. "I'm afraid that's not all. Not only can it move, but it also knows how to camouflage. When we saw it, it was pretending to be dead. But when we left, it took the opportunity to run away. Could it be that the thing that attacked Luna deliberately did that? In order to divert our attention? Ruby was shocked. How is it possible? It was cut by Eugene's sword. If it was a premature baby like us, it would be good if it didn't die. How could it pretend to be dead? This. Dean stared at the ground next to the egg. He could vaguely see the traces of the egg slipping along the ground until it reached the rock wall. When he saw it, his expression changed slightly. There was an obvious mark left behind by the monster from before on the rock wall. This meant that this little one was most likely saved by that monster. Rosemary came back to her senses and hurriedly said, "We can't stay here any longer. If these eggs hatch, I'm afraid." She was afraid that they wouldn't be able to leave. Ian understood what she meant and made a prompt decision. "Pack up. We're leaving this place immediately." Martin glanced at the eggs scattered all over the ground and said, "These things are a scourge in the end. Why don't we destroy them all before we leave?" Ian was startled. "If we destroy them and report to the family, then we won't be able to get the medal." Martin said, "But if we return to the family and report to the family, then we will have to wait for the pioneers to come and pick them up. It will take too long. If some of these things have hatched and we come to the wasteland again in the future to perform the task, then the possibility of encountering these things will be very high. It will be more dangerous." Dean glanced at him. He didn't expect this man to not be blinded by greed, but to think very far. But it was obviously unnecessary. They were not the only team that came to the wasteland. With the growth and destructive power of these things, once they attracted the attention of the family, they would certainly send pioneers to clean them up. If they were destroyed, then they wouldn't get anything. For them, it would be the biggest loss. Of course, the price of doing this was to put other teams in danger and pay a heavy price. Let's talk about the future in the future. Ian pressed on Martin's shoulder and said in a deep voice, "You've seen the potential of this thing. It's very likely to be a new type of monster. The family is likely to reward us with a lot of medals, which is equivalent to the sum of 10 missions we've completed. We can also use this opportunity to get rid of this endless battle." Martin glanced at him. After a moment of silence, he nodded slightly and said, "I understand." Ian no longer delayed. "Let's go up." Dean looked at the more than 20 meters high hole above his head. Who can jump up? Such a height had exceeded the jumping height of ordinary limitless. Rosemary said, "I will do it." Her body shook slightly. Her bones made cracking sounds as she crouched on the ground in a strange posture like a praying mantis. Then she jumped up and directly bounced up to the top of the hole. After climbing up the hole, Rosemary threw down the rope that Luna had used to climb up the hole. Dean was not polite. He jumped up and grabbed the rope before it fell and quickly climbed up. Ian and Martin were startled. They suddenly realized a problem. Their faces slightly changed, but it was impossible to stop Dean. At this moment, Dean was climbing up the rope to the top of the hole. Ian and Martin were silent. They quickly climbed up the rope. Ruby was at the back. He was a little nervous. He swallowed his saliva and climbed up the rope with both hands. Chapter 535. "Hurry up," Ian urged as he squatted at the edge of the hole. Ruby didn't need to say anything. He grabbed the rope at the same time as Ian went up. His other hand was holding the torch, and his feet were rubbing the rope as he climbed up. Suddenly a gust of wind came from nowhere. The flame on the torch fluttered slightly, as if it was going to be extinguished. There was a trace of panic in Ruby's heart. He couldn't help but turn his head and look around. In the gloomy darkness around him, it seemed that the thing would suddenly jump out. Thinking of the horrible scene of Luna's death, his throat moved slightly. He didn't dare to stay any longer. He pulled the rope with one hand and quickly climbed up. When he was halfway up, there was a sudden whoosh sound. Ruby's pupil shrank as he looked at the source of the sound. He saw an arrow shooting straight for the top of the hole. It brushed past the edge of the torch, and the airflow made the flame erratic. Clang! The arrowhead seemed to hit the metal surface, making a sharp sound. "It's behind you," Ian hurriedly shouted. "Come up." Ruby's face turned pale. He didn't look back like a fool. He didn't even take the torch in his hand. He quickly grabbed the rope with both hands and climbed quickly. In the blink of an eye, he rushed to the top of the hole. Until his palm was caught by Ian, his heart was slightly relieved. Suddenly, he felt as if something was on the sole of his foot, and his body suddenly sank down. No, Ruby was frightened. He hurriedly lifted his other foot and kicked. Whoosh! Another arrow whizzed past. Clang! Ruby only felt that his foot was light. His body suddenly soared up and was pulled to the top of the hole by Ian. He was a little frightened. His dark face was full of cold sweat. He sat on the edge of the hole and turned his head to look at the bottom of the dark hole. It was dark inside. The fallen torch was like a weak flame. It gradually extinguished, and there seemed to be a shadow passing by the flame before it was extinguished. Ruby swallowed his saliva. He only felt that he had a brush with death. He turned his head and looked to the side. He saw that Dean slowly hung the bow on his back. Obviously, the previous 2 arrows were shot by Dean. He didn't expect that Dean would help him. His heart was warm. He gratefully said, "Thank you. Thank you. It's nothing." Dean glanced around. "It's not safe here. This thing is likely to climb out and chase us. We should leave as soon as possible." Ian breathed a sigh of relief when he saw that Ruby was fine. He nodded and said, "That's right. Everyone, apply the powder. Be careful. Don't disturb the big guy outside." Martin glanced at Dudian. The hostility in his eyes converged a bit. He took out the undead powder from his backpack and smeared it on his face. He waited for the others to finish disguising themselves and then walked in front. Following the path that they came from, the group's footsteps were silent. They lightly stepped over the skeletons on the ground, not making the slightest noise. As they got closer and closer to the outside of the cave, everyone became more and more nervous. Even Dean couldn't help but hold his breath. He had already planned for the second step. Once the monster was disturbed, he would immediately rush out of the cave. As long as he rushed out of the cave, he could fly away with the help of his wings. Although doing so would expose his ability to the eyes of Ian and others. Whether they could survive was still a problem. Moreover, at this moment of life and death, he couldn't care so much. In the dark and damp cave, in addition to the rancid and bloody smell, there was a strange smell. It was a bit like the smell of a corpse soaked in rotten water. It was somewhat similar to the smell of the previous nest under the cave, but there were some differences. Several people gently sniffed and smelled the strange smell. Their expressions were somewhat dignified. They knew that the big guy was not far away. Dean's whole body muscles were tense, ready to rush out at any time. Ian gave Martin a wink, indicating that the thing was probably in the corner in front of them. Martin also sensed that the smell in the air was so strong that it stung his nose. He could sense that the thing was getting closer and closer, and this made him feel quite nervous. He gripped his weapon tightly and lightly stepped forward, not making a single sound. He plucked up his courage and peeped out of the corner of his eye. Dean, Ian, and Ruby suddenly felt that Martin's body was slightly stiff. Their hearts couldn't help but jump, and they were ready to respond at any time. After a while, Martin slowly retracted his head, made a gesture to everyone to keep quiet, and then lowered his body and slowly walked forward. Dean's eyes flashed. He held his breath and quietly followed behind. When he saw the thing behind the corner, he immediately knew the reason why Martin's body was slightly stiff. He saw that in the exit passage behind the corner, there was a huge and terrifying shadow crawling on the ground. It looked like a lizard and a poisonous scorpion with several forked tails. Its whole body was covered with silver scales. It was huge, but its body was slender, just enough to fit into the cave. On both sides of its body, there were strange limbs like spider legs and centipede feet, some long and some short. The moment Dean saw this thing, he felt a sense of horror, but what really shocked him was that he recognized the appearance of this monster. In the Monster Atlas, it was one of the 8 legendary monsters, the Shadow Hunter. This was a super monster that was as famous as the Splitter. Different from the extreme attack type of the Splitter, the Shadow Hunter was good at lurking and sneak attacks. It belonged to the top lurking monsters. To some extent, it was more terrifying than the Splitter. Even monsters that were much stronger than the Shadow Hunter could be killed by its sneak attack. Even some of the strongest human beings couldn't escape its claws. Ian and Ruby were aghast. They also recognized the identity of this monster. They never thought that in this orange wasteland, they would encounter a legendary monster that was hard to come by in 100 years. A trace of greed flashed in Ian's eyes, but it was quickly covered by fear. He held his breath, and his muscles tightened. In front of the Shadow Hunter, who was good at lurking, their current lurking ability was simply at the level of a newborn child, not worth mentioning. He suddenly felt a little regretful. If he knew this big guy was the legendary Shadow Hunter, he would rather starve to death in the nest than come out. But now that he was already halfway there, he could only bite the bullet and continue. He could only pray that this Shadow Hunter was sleeping soundly enough and wouldn't be woken up by them. It looks like a mature Shadow Hunter with a hunting level of 64 to 67. Dean glanced at the form of the Shadow Hunter. The Monster Atlas had a relatively simple record of legendary monsters, only depicting the mature and complete stages. He suddenly noticed that the silver scales on the Shadow Hunter's body were similar to the shape of the silver scales he saw when he entered the cave. In addition, this Shadow Hunter's extremely ferocious triangular head was also somewhat familiar, very similar to the terrifying monster that hatched in the nest. However, the triangular arc on its head was slightly inwardly concave, making the triangular protrusion on its head protrude outwards like a sharp thorn, making it look sharper and more ferocious. Dean immediately understood, and his face turned ugly. Obviously, the whole cave was its territory. The Whisper and the Blood Cinder were mostly the food it captured, and the eggs in the nest were the Shadow Hunter cubs it gave birth to. However, the shape of the Shadow Hunter they met before was different from this one, so they didn't think of this for a while. After all, monsters would undergo a metamorphosis at every stage, and some of the metamorphoses would be so drastic that they would no longer resemble their previous appearance. Dean had a kind of terrifying feeling when he was brought back to the nest by the splitter. His eyes slowly shifted to the cave in front of him. Not far behind this Shadow Hunter was the cave exit. As long as he rushed out, he could escape with the help of his wings. Just a little bit more. He moved forward cautiously. Crack! Suddenly, a soft sound came from behind. Chapter 536. Ruby's whole body froze, cold sweat gushing out of his body in an instant. Damn it, Dean cursed in his heart, but he didn't care about scolding them. His body suddenly leaped forward. At this point, he naturally wouldn't expect that the Shadow Hunter didn't hear it. Instead of holding such an illusion, it was better to run away at full speed. At least there was a chance. After being stunned for a moment, Ian and Martin immediately reacted. Angry in their hearts, they instantly rushed forward. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. The three of them suddenly ran at full speed, making whistling sounds of wind and footsteps. Along the way, some monster skeletons were crushed into pieces. Seeing the three of them running away in an instant, Ruby reacted and hurriedly followed them. When Dean was about to overtake Ian, he suddenly saw Ian raise his arms slightly. His face changed, and a strong, killing intent flashed in his eyes. Without the slightest pause, he stretched out his wrist. Bang! When he passed by Ian, Ian raised his arm and slammed it toward him. Dean was already prepared. His arm grabbed Ian's attacking arm and pulled it backward. Ian was stunned. The next moment, his body lost balance. He staggered a little and almost fell down. By the time he stabilized his body, Dean had already swept past him. Dean had even surpassed Martin, who was in front of him, and rushed to the front. Everyone knew that when encountering a monster, one didn't need to run faster than the monster. He just needed to run faster than his companions. At this time, Ruby had already caught up from behind. There was a trace of horror on Ian's face. He hatefully looked at Dean's back in front of him, then suddenly raised his arm and waved at Ruby, who was chasing behind him. Ruby didn't expect that Ian would attack him. He couldn't react in time. Bang! His face was hit by the back of Ian's hand. Suddenly, his nasal cavity ruptured, nosebleed, and his body was knocked backward. Ian quickly rushed out and caught up with Martin in front of him. Ruby endured the sharp pain. Her heart was filled with anger and fear as she madly ran away. In this dark cave, several figures quickly swept past. In the blink of an eye, they left the shadow hunter and rushed to the exit of the cave. Dean looked at the exit that was close at hand. He could see the dark green vines and sunlight outside the exit. A glimmer of hope suddenly emerged in his heart. Sunshine always seemed to bring hope. Whoosh! Dean rushed straight out of the cave. The moment he stepped outside, his whole body was bathed in the sunlight. He was a little relieved in his heart. His eyes shifted to the back and hurriedly glanced. He didn't have time to look before, but now he saw Martin and Ian rushing almost side by side. Ruby, who was more than 10 meters behind them, followed closely behind, and the shadow hunters in the deeper part of the cave actually didn't move. Ian was startled. Martin and Ian were fast approaching. Dean came back to his senses, and his heart suddenly moved. He didn't follow his previous idea of stepping out of the cave and spreading his wings. Instead, he turned around and ran down the mountain. But he couldn't help but have some doubts in his heart. Was this shadow hunter really sleeping soundly? If the commotion caused by Ruby didn't wake him up, then the sound of them running at full speed should have woken him up, right? In the blink of an eye, Dean had rushed to the foot of the mountain. When he passed by the body of the corpse pecker, he saw a few colorful insects lying on the body and gnawing on it. They were bloodthirsty insects that were common in the forest. Their hunting level was low, but they could secrete toxins. If one was not careful, even a senior hunter would suffer in front of them. Dean saw Ian and Martin rushing down one after another. His attention was focused on them, but he didn't see Ruby following him. He also didn't feel the movement of the shadow hunters. He was a little relieved, and his eyes fell on Ian. Although he could understand Ian's mood at that time, if it wasn't for his quick reaction, this behavior would have put him to death. Seeing Dean's unfriendly face, Ian's face was a little ugly. If it wasn't necessary, he really didn't want to be enemies with Dean. You guys come quickly. Suddenly, Ruby's voice came from the mountain. It was not the fear they imagined, but full of shock and even a hint of surprise. The three of them were startled. They looked at each other and looked up at the mountain, but they didn't move. No one could be sure whether this would be a trap set by Ruby, who was lagging behind, to get them to go back and help him. You guys come quickly. This legendary monster is dead. It's dead. Ruby's voice came from the deep grass. With a rustling sound, the grass was pushed away by his burly body. His head was full of sweat, but his face was red, and he looked very excited. Dean was startled. A lot of information suddenly flashed in his mind. His heart jumped, and he quickly rushed toward Ruby, then swept past him and returned to the cave on the mountain. Ian and Martin were startled for a moment. They didn't expect Dean to be so courageous. He dared to return to the horrible lair just because of Ruby's words. If he deliberately lied to retaliate against Ian's previous behavior, wouldn't he take the initiative to go back and die? While the two were hesitating, Ruby saw Dean go back, so he immediately turned and followed him back. Seeing this scene, the two were taken aback. They looked at each other and immediately saw the shock in each other's eyes. Could it be that what Ruby said was true? The two couldn't care so much and quickly followed Ruby back to the mountain. As soon as they arrived at the open space, they saw Dean standing in front of the cave, looking inside. But the shadow hunter didn't rush out to chase them. Thinking of this, the two showed a bit of excitement on their faces and immediately came to the cave. Dean stared at the shadow hunter inside, and his eyes suddenly showed shock. His judgment was right. Ruby didn't lie. This shadow hunter was really dead. On its back, there was a hole with a diameter of nearly 1 meter, and the silver scales on its surface were completely shattered. The injury was extremely serious, and judging from the location, it was also a fatal part. It was actually dead. The shadow hunter, known as the best at hiding among the legendary monsters, actually died in its own lair. Dean was shocked. The reason why he dared to come back was mainly because he thought of his previous inference. The ovaries under the cave obviously belonged to this shadow hunter. It didn't make sense for it to sleep here. Moreover, Until he rushed out of the cave, this shadow hunter didn't chase them. If he added the conclusion that it was dead in front of these doubtful points, everything could be explained. He suddenly thought of the movement they heard when they fell into the ovaries while digging the soil 5 days ago. At that time, the last sound they heard was a roar, and then it completely stopped. I should have thought of it earlier. What kind of monster would roar like that when it's asleep? It must have been attacked at that time, and it was this fatal attack. In other words, it was dead at that time. Dean's face changed. Although the shadow hunter's death was a good thing for them, and they didn't have to run for their lives, didn't this mean a more terrible thing? At that time, in this cave, there was something more terrible than this shadow hunter. What was it that could kill this shadow hunter with one blow? After all, this was a mature legendary monster. Although its hunting level was only between 64 and 67, its actual combat ability was comparable to that of a normal monster with a hunting level of over 100. Moreover, with the shadow hunter's superb lurking ability, it was actually killed by another monster. It was simply inconceivable. If that thing had already set up an ambush before it entered the cave and launched a sneak attack, then it wouldn't make sense. After all, in terms of ambush, the shadow hunter was the best in this field. Dean's face was ugly. Suddenly, for the first time, he felt that in this world outside the giant wall, his life was not under his control. Fortunately, that thing didn't take a fancy to them. Otherwise, with this kind of skill, it would be easy to kill them. At this time, Ian and Martin also came to the side of the cave and looked inside. Soon, their faces were filled with horror. Chapter 537. Ian and others couldn't help but look at Ruby next to him. Ruby glanced at Ian, and a trace of resentment flashed in his eyes, but he quickly restrained it. He knew that if he questioned Ian at this time, he would absolutely not have a good ending. In this wasteland outside the wall, except for Dean, Martin and Rosemary would definitely be led by Ian. Even if he was in the right in this matter, Ian wouldn't be biased towards him. After all, reason was nothing in front of benefits. He took a deep breath and said in a low voice, "I panicked when I saw that you were running so fast, and I accidentally fell. When I got up and looked back, I saw the big hole on its back. That's when I knew that it was probably dead." Hearing this, Dean nodded. Suddenly, his heart moved and his eyes slightly narrowed. Although he didn't look back, his eyes fell on Ian, Martin, and Rosemary. Because he was facing Ruby, he immediately saw Ian, Martin, and Rosemary exchanging glances. Dean slightly sneered, secretly gathering his strength, ready to attack at any time. Although this shadow hunter was dead, its body was a big treasure, especially the legendary magic mark in its body, which was even more valuable. From the look of the three people exchanging glances, it was obvious that they intended to kill him first. Ruby noticed the look of the three people, and his face slightly changed. He suddenly gritted his teeth and said to Dean, "Let's cooperate." "Cooperate?" Dean slightly raised his eyebrows, looking at him, and suddenly understood something. "They want to deal with you, so let's cooperate. I'll give you the legendary magic mark in this shadow hunter's body, and after we go back, we'll report the lair inside to the family, and we'll split the medals 50-50. How about it?" Ruby stared at Dean's eyes. He had already gone all out. Ian's previous treatment of him was mostly to prevent him from holding a grudge. Even if he survived this crisis, it would be difficult for him to mix in the team in the future, and he would gradually be marginalized. Even during some missions, if the other party used a little trick, his corpse would be exposed in the wilderness. Therefore, he had to risk it. Dean glanced at him and nodded. "Okay." Ian and the other two people's faces slightly changed, looking at Ruby with surprise and anger. Martin angrily shouted, "Bastard, do you know what you're talking about? We are a team. How can we kill each other?" "Yeah, Ruby, don't be silly," Rosemary said hurriedly. Ian looked at Ruby apologetically and said, "I'm really sorry before. I was anxious and didn't notice you. I'm really sorry." Upon hearing this, Ruby's heart turned colder. If Ian admitted it generously, he might still have some doubts. However, Ian said that he didn't mean it. If he really believed it, he would be an idiot. Dean turned to look at the emotional performance of the three. Didn't you say that you were life and death teammates? But when you were escaping, you actually tried to kill me. Is this your friendship? Ian's expression changed slightly. He looked at him coldly and said, "What do you mean by that? You want to keep this legendary parasitic soulworm for yourself?" Ian indifferently said, "Speaking of this, it should be you who want to take everything for yourself. Are you sure that he will let you go back alive? If he can do such things to me and Ruby, then he can do the same to you. Or are you planning to kill me and Ruby, then deal with the others? Or are you planning to take the opportunity to kill them in the process of besieging me and Ruby? Or are you secretly saving your strength and waiting for the end of the battle to kill your exhausted teammates?" "Nonsense!" Ian shouted angrily. He was so angry that his body trembled slightly. At the same time, there was a trace of fear in his heart. He glanced at Rosemary and Martin beside him and secretly became vigilant. Although he knew that Dean's words were deliberately to drive a wedge between them, his heart still involuntarily trembled because what Dean said was very likely. At this time, in front of the temptation of two treasures, a legendary parasitic soulworm and a legendary monster's ovary, it was hard for him to believe anyone else. Martin's and Rosemary's faces turned slightly pale, and cold sweat overflowed from their temples. Looking at the smiling and indifferent young man in front of them, they felt a trace of fear and dread. With just a few words, he had made their team, which had just secretly formed an alliance, leave the table. Such a mouth was better than the sharpest blade. Don't listen to his nonsense. He is deliberately driving a wedge between us. If we fight alone, we are most likely not his opponent. We have to fight together. Ian gritted his teeth and said. Martin and Rosemary glanced at him and nodded slightly, but there was some wavering and vigilance in their hearts. They did not dare to completely leave their backs to each other. At the same time, as Dean said, they did not dare to go all out. In case the other two secretly saved their strength, after killing Dean, they would not be able to compete with each other. Seeing that Dean was about to speak again, Ian knew that he could not let him speak anymore. He suddenly shouted angrily, "Ruby, why are you not doing it?" Dean and Ruby were startled. If it was an ordinary person, it was estimated that they would instinctively look back or avoid, but Dean's eyes had been paying attention to Ruby. The reason why he was startled was that he did not expect Ian to suddenly say such words, but the next moment, he suddenly thought of beating him at his own game. He turned his head. Ian and the other two saw the opportunity and immediately stepped forward. At this moment, Dean's 270-degree field of vision played a key role. Although he turned his head, he could still see the actions of the three people. His body suddenly turned, and the bones of his whole body became extremely light and ethereal. His body swept like a whirlwind towards Ian, who was rushing in the middle. With a bang, he suddenly raised his hand and chopped at Ian's wrist. Then, with a simple elbow strike, he hit Ian's chest armor. Ian's body was shocked, and his face was full of shock. He stepped back a few steps and swallowed the blood that had rushed to his throat. Dean quickly avoided Martin and Rosemary's knife and one-handed sword. His body slid like a loach and once again opened the distance between them. He returned to Ruby's side and whispered, "Get ready. It is a bit difficult for me to deal with 3 people alone." Ruby nodded slightly, pulled out his axe, and held it tightly in his hand. Ian clenched his teeth, growled, and rushed towards Dean again. Suddenly, whoosh! A strong gust of wind suddenly blew, causing the surrounding trees and deep grass to rustle. Then a whistling sound of the wind came from the distant sky. The 5 people fighting on the ground could not help but divert part of their attention to the sky, and they were suddenly stunned. They saw a huge bat-shaped wing descending from the sky, hanging over the top of the 5 people, blocking all the sunlight above. A terrible shadow shrouded the top of the 5 people, exuding the breath of death. When Dean saw the middle body of the huge wing, his eyelids twitched, and he was a little shocked. This was not a monster, but a human youth. Wing family. Ian and the others saw this person and cried out in shock. Dean was startled and suddenly noticed that the style of the armor on this person was a bit strange. It was completely different from the pattern of the dragon family, and the color was darker. On the chest of the armor, there were two flying wings floating in gold, and the veins were clear. Chapter 538. This was the first time Dean saw a winged family member. After he glanced at him, a glimmer of light flashed in his eyes. Suddenly, his heart shivered. Through thermal vision, he could see that the heat in this person's body was extremely vigorous, like a strong flame, far better than anyone present. It was not inferior to Hathaway. Obviously, this person was most likely a wing family pioneer. He suddenly thought of the shadow hunter behind him, and his face changed slightly. His eyes didn't move, but his sight quietly shifted to the surrounding environment. If I'm not mistaken, you're a winged family warrior, right? The shock on Ian's face gradually disappeared, and his expression became a little gloomy. Thinking of the shadow hunter's corpse behind him, he slowly stepped forward, blocking the cave a little, and coldly said, "Your winged family actually dares to step into our dragon family's wasteland without permission. Aren't you afraid of death? There are dragon family pioneers wandering around here. You'd better leave immediately." The winged family youth slowly raised his eyes. A pair of green eyes lightly looked at Ian, but his line of sight gently swept past Ian's body and looked at the cave behind him. He seemed to notice something in the darkness, and his eyes slightly brightened. But soon, he noticed something suspicious, and his face revealed a bit of surprise. His eyes once again fell on Ian's face, and he asked, "This shadow hunter, did you kill it?" Ian and the others' faces changed, and they immediately clenched their weapons, ready to fight. With your insignificant strength, it should be impossible for you to kill a shadow hunter. So that's how it is. You just want to take advantage of the situation? The Wing family youth muttered to himself. He slightly shook his head and smiled, feeling funny for his excessive caution. The huge bat wings on his back quickly folded into a ball, like he was carrying a black shield. He lifted his feet and walked toward the cave as if there was no one else. Dean's eyes flashed, and his body slightly moved to the side, not stopping him. In front of the cave, Ian and the other two people's faces slightly changed. They didn't expect Dean to actually step back. Did he intend to let them fight with the enemy first? Thinking of this, the three people secretly cursed in their hearts, but they didn't follow Dean's example and step aside. After all, once they stepped back, it was equal to surrendering the legendary magic marks to the enemy. "Stop!" Ian gritted his teeth. The winged race youth acted as if he didn't hear anything and walked forward calmly. Ruby, who was standing in the front, felt an inexplicable sense of tension. He swallowed his saliva, hesitated, and finally clenched his teeth. Like Ian, he moved to the side. "Go!" Ian roared. Martin suddenly rushed out, and his figure seemed to suddenly split into three. He waved his saber and slashed at the youth of the wing race. Seeing this, Ruby's expression changed slightly, knowing that he was serious. Puff! Suddenly, the sound of flesh tearing echoed. Blood spurted out, and a head floated in front of Ruby and Dean. It fell to the ground and rolled 4 or 5 meters away. It was Martin's head. There was a trace of astonishment on his face. Everyone's expression changed. There was a trace of shock in Dean's eyes. Although he expected that the youth of the wing race was extremely strong and not an ordinary pioneer, he didn't expect that he was so strong. Cold sweat overflowed from his back, and his whole body was stiff. This was the feeling of being locked by a murderous aura. He was like a frog being stared at by a poisonous snake. He didn't dare to jump or move, lest he disturb the time, because the next moment would be his death. Ian, Rosemary, and Ruby's pupils shrank, and their faces were full of horror. They didn't expect that the strength of the youth of the wing race was so terrifying. They suddenly understood why Dean retreated. It was not because he wanted them to fight and consume their strength, but because Dean's thermal vision ability had seen clearly from the beginning that the strength of the youth of the wing race was not something they could resist. Ian's teeth were chattering as he stared at the young man of the wings race walking towards him. His heart was pounding like crazy. It was as if the young man's light footsteps were stepping on his heart with every step. Ian's hand that was holding his weapon was frozen. The strong pressure from the young man was like an invisible hand that tightly gripped his body, making it impossible for him to move. His palms trembled slightly, and he slowly moved his feet. Before the youth of the wing race came over, he tried to move to the side, making way for the youth. At this moment, the legendary magic mark of the Shadow Hunter was no longer in his mind. There was only fear and a strong desire to survive. Rosemary followed closely behind Ian to make way. Her face was pale, as she didn't dare to look directly at the youth's face. The youth of the wing race looked straight ahead and ignored the two people. He went straight into the cave and walked toward the huge corpse of the Shadow Hunter. Seeing the youth enter the cave, Ian was relieved. He slightly gathered strength on the soles of his feet, and just as he was about to escape, he suddenly heard the voice of the youth. "Don't rush to leave. I still have some questions to ask you. If you don't want to die, be obedient." Ian's face changed slightly. He looked out of the corner of his eyes, but he saw that the youth didn't look back. Instead, he came to the front of the Shadow Hunter and squatted down, looking up and down at the Shadow Hunter. Although he gave his back to the youth, Ian didn't have the slightest idea of sneak attack. He even had a feeling that once he escaped, he would be immediately caught and killed by the youth. Dean saw that Ian, Rosemary, and Ruby were all scared and gave up the idea of escaping. There was a trace of disappointment and even annoyance in his heart. He wanted to wait for Ian and the others to escape, and then he would also take the opportunity to escape. As long as they ran separately, he didn't believe that the youth could catch up with them at the same time. In this way, someone would successfully escape. And if he continued to wait, he didn't need to think to know that the youth would most likely ask questions about the cause of death of the Shadow Hunter. Once the questions were asked, it would be time to silence them. From the behavior of the youth, it seemed that he had long known the existence of the Shadow Hunter. If it was to deal with the Dragon Guards, then he could have killed all of them as soon as he appeared. He would even use the method of sneak attack, which was more secure and ensured that no one was missed. If he came for the Shadow Hunter, then the reason was obvious. There were spies planted by the Wing family in the Dragon Guards or related high-level officials, and they revealed the traces left by the Shadow Hunter in Orange Wasteland No. 3 to the Wing family. That was why the Wing family didn't hesitate to take the risk of sneaking in to look for it. The youth looked at the fatal wound on the back of the Shadow Hunter and was somewhat surprised. Then he looked at the rest of the body and the surrounding environment, and the surprise in his eyes suddenly turned into shock. There is no trace of a fierce battle, and the wound is fatal. How is it possible? Did something come out from the depths of the wasteland? His face flashed, and he no longer hesitated. He took out a small bottle from his pocket and sprinkled it on the wound. Some pale yellow powder floated down. After sprinkling some evenly, he put away the bottle and waited quietly. In the blink of an eye, a few minutes passed, but there was no movement on the wound as he expected. The parasitic soul worm is gone. The youth's face sank, and he frowned. Chapter 539. When the Wing family youth sprinkled the powder to lure the parasitic soul worm on the Shadow Hunter's body, Dean and the other three at the cave's exit stiffened. This was an excellent opportunity to escape, but the four of them didn't move. Everyone knew that the first one to move would be hit by the Wing family youth's thunderous attack. The four of them happened to be smart people, but at this moment, they were like a group of smart pigs. No one wanted to be cannon fodder and create an opportunity for others to escape. The final result would only be to be killed one by one. Ian felt his throat was a little dry. He swallowed his saliva stiffly, and cold sweat poured down his back. He knew what would be waiting for them once the Wing family youth collected the parasitic soul worm. However, he also knew that the first one to escape would never have a good ending. Therefore, he could only endure. When others couldn't bear it anymore, it would be his opportunity. However, he was obviously not the only one with such an idea. Time passed second by second. Every second felt especially long, and it gave people a kind of painful feeling of torment. Dean's face was ugly. If the situation continued to be deadlocked, they would die. However, no one could break this deadlock. Even if he had a full of ideas, there was nothing he could do. He suddenly discovered that the real deadlock was human nature. He no longer pinned his hopes on Ian and the other two. His vision slowly shifted to the surroundings, and his thoughts turned quickly. Suddenly, his eyes narrowed slightly, thinking of the only chance to survive at the moment when the Wing family youth collected the parasitic soulworm. He should immediately escape. When he was collecting the parasitic soulworm, the possibility of the Wing family youth chasing them was the lowest, and it was the only chance at the moment. He couldn't continue to fight with Ian and the other two. Everyone was afraid of death, and no one was willing to make the first move. The final result would only be total annihilation. However, after a few minutes, the Wing family youth, who noticed that the parasitic soulworm was no longer in the shadow hunter's body, slowly got up, turned around, and walked out of the cave. Dudian was stunned as he saw this scene. He didn't notice when this person collected the parasitic soulworm. Could it be that his speed was so fast that his vision couldn't keep up? Or he didn't collect it at all? Or there was no parasitic soulworm in the shadow hunter's body? You guys. The Wing family youth's expression was much colder than before. He said while walking, "Who has the parasitic soulworm?" Ian and the other two were stunned. Dean thought of the speculation in his heart and instantly reacted. Out of survival instinct, he pointed at Ian. "It's on him." Ian was shocked by Dudian's reaction. He saw Dudian's finger pointing at him. His face turned pale as he said in a hurry, "No, it's not on me. He is slandering me." "Is that so?" The young man of the Wings race looked indifferent as he walked towards Ian step by step. He slowly stretched out his hand and said, "Give it to me." Ian looked at him in horror. There was a suffocating feeling of fear. He suddenly realized that it was useless to explain. This Wing family youth might not believe Dean's words, but for the latter, they were all lambs waiting to be slaughtered. It was just that the order was different. If he couldn't find the parasitic soul worm on him, he would look for them one by one. However, he was the first one to be slaughtered. Thinking of this, his cheeks twitched slightly, and his expression became a little distorted. He clenched his teeth and suddenly threw out the saber in his hand. It shot towards the youth like a flash of silver light. At the same time, he raised his hand and punched towards Rosemary, who was beside him. He wanted to push her towards the youth to buy time for himself. He knew that for the Wing family youth, Rosemary was also an ant that could be killed at any time. But Rosemary would most likely resist, even if this resistance could buy him one more second. However, at the same time that Ian threw out his punch, Rosemary, who had been motionless, suddenly twisted her body and dodged the punch with a weird posture that was impossible for a human body to perform. She then grabbed Ian's wrist and dragged him into the cave. She then turned around and rushed toward the foot of the mountain in the blink of an eye. Ian was dumbfounded. The moment his body fell forward, his mind went blank. Dean and Ruby reacted instantly. Although they were surprised by this instantaneous change, they did not stop and immediately ran toward the foot of the mountain. Although they could avoid being caught by the Wing family youth by using different routes to escape, they were familiar with the route to the foot of the mountain. Moreover, this route was the smoothest, which could maximize their speed. All three of them wanted to fight for this route. For a time, all three of them ran toward the same place. Ian fell to the ground with his hands on the ground. Before he could get up, a foot stretched out from the ground in front of him. His whole body suddenly stiffened. He raised his head in a daze and looked up at the Wing family youth in front of him. The Wing family youth lifted Ian's body. To be precise, he lifted Ian's shoulder like an eagle lifting a chick. He glanced at Dean and the other two who were rushing down the mountain. Ian's heart was beating wildly. He slightly opened his mouth and said, "Sir, I can tell you." His voice came to an abrupt stop. The Wing family youth's other hand pinched Ian's face and gently twisted it. With a crack, Ian's cervical vertebra suddenly broke. Until the last moment of his death, Ian did not have the courage to fight. Whoosh! Throwing away Ian's body, The Wing family youth's figure suddenly swayed and disappeared from the place. In the rugged foothills, three figures rushed out quickly. Gradually, one of the figures approached the slender figure in the front at an astonishing speed. It was Dean. Whoosh! Two thin wings suddenly stretched out from the gap of the armor on his back. They were translucent like the wings of insects. The frequency of the wings was so high that it was almost impossible to see them with the naked eye. Propelled by the wings of the splitter, Dean's body was like a ray of black light. He instantly surpassed Rosemary, who was in the front, and then in the blink of an eye, he left the two of them far behind and reached the foot of the mountain first. Courting death. Dean did not look back, but his eyes were looking at the back. He knew that the two of them would be caught sooner or later. The next problem was to find a way to get rid of the Wing family youth's pursuit. However, one of the trump cards he relied on, the flying wings, happened to be restrained by the Wing family youth. With the size of the huge bat wings, the speed of the latter's flying might be far faster than his. Moreover, the latter came from the Wing family, so he most likely had some special flying skills. Suddenly, a scream came from behind. Chapter 540. Damn it! Dean clenched his fists and rushed forward, but his heart was getting colder and colder. If he continued to run like this, he would only delay the time of death. He couldn't get rid of the grim Reaper chasing him. I can't fly, and I can't run on land. I must find a way to hide. If I continue to run, I will be caught sooner or later. Dean's whole body was tense, and cold sweat was pouring out. His mind quickly flashed through the hiding methods he was good at, but they were rejected one by one. It was the first time they met, and he was not familiar with the ability of this youth. If the latter had thermal vision, even if he drilled into the quagmire, he would still die, and his death would be even more ridiculous. Suddenly, another scream came from behind, but it was a female voice. It was Rosemary. Dean's heart tightened. This voice was closer to him. His pupils shrank slightly, his face was pale, and his heart was burning with anxiety and despair. He felt that death was approaching him step by step. In this situation where there was no information, there was a sense of powerlessness and despair. Moreover, the tight time did not allow him to think slowly. His mind was suddenly in a mess, and he was a little confused. Although he was calm enough, in this extremely desperate and urgent situation, it was difficult for his mind to think effectively. If only I knew his ability, if only I knew his ability. Dean thought painfully and anxiously. Suddenly, he was startled. A few fragments flashed in his mind, and his chaotic thoughts suddenly became clear. Without hesitation, he instantly pressed the lock on the backpack. With a clatter, the backpack fell with his body shaking and fell on the dusty, broken road under his feet. The sound of canned food and water came from inside. Dean only felt that his body was a little lighter and the speed of his feet was a little faster. His wings should be one of his abilities. While speeding up, Dean's thoughts quickly peeled off the clues. Unlike Splitter's wings, which have a short gliding effect, his wings are specially suitable for flight. This should be an inherent parasitic soul worm cultivated by his family, which is suitable for flying. This kind of parasitic soul worm is usually accompanied by keen vision. Previously, he saw the shadow hunter's body in the cave at a glance, so he should have night vision. To be able to find the cave in the dense jungle, it should be high magnification vision or thermal vision. His back was facing Ian earlier, but he sensed that Ian wanted to run. Maybe it was a psychological guess, or maybe he's like me and has a wide field of vision, but it's also possible that his hearing is extremely sharp, and he sensed that when Ian stepped on the ground, it was extremely small. That's how he deduced Ian's plan. Thinking of this, Dean's eyes flashed. From the current clues, this Wing family youth had night vision, suspected high magnification vision and thermal vision, and suspected keen hearing. As for the sense of smell, there were no clues for now. In any case, Dean could only take these possibilities into account. After all, there was only one chance. Only, if these suspected abilities were taken into account, there would be too many things he had to take precautions against. This way, there would be no way for him to hide. Whoosh! Dean's feet suddenly left the ground. The wings on his back fluttered rapidly, and he flew forward at a low altitude. Although the wings of the splitter were gliding boosts for the splitter for someone of his size, they were enough to be used as flying wings, allowing him to soar tens of thousands of meters. At this moment, he flew straight down the street. He lowered his height, picked up a stone from the ground, and threw it in another direction. With a bang, the stone fell on an adjacent street. While Dean flew forward, he looked back. His pupils shrank to the extreme, and his thermal vision was exerted to the maximum. He felt his eyes were as hot as blood. Suddenly, he saw a bright red figure chasing behind him, quickly approaching him. His face changed slightly. Not attracted by the sound, he immediately landed on the ground, and with the help of the wings, he pressed his body forward to almost touch the ground and rush forward. His speed was faster than pure flying. While he was trying his best to escape, he felt a chill in his heart. His main purpose of doing this was to test whether the young man's suspected ability was real or not. But now, it seemed that the young man's thermal vision was almost certain. Only in this way could he explain that the Wing family youth did not follow the source of the sound, but chased after him. What should I do? Dean was at a loss for a moment. He suddenly felt that when the thermal vision was tracking the prey, it caused a strong sense of death to the prey. He couldn't get rid of it, couldn't hide. Could it be that he could only wait for him to catch up? All these thoughts flashed through his mind in an instant. Suddenly, Dean thought of something and couldn't help but look at his left hand. Could it be that he could only choose this self-destructive method? With a little hesitation in his heart, he saw the bright red figure getting closer and closer. He suddenly gritted his teeth, no longer thinking and no longer suppressing the cold feeling in his left hand. Instead, he clenched his left hand and stimulated his muscles. In an instant, the cold condensed in his left hand was like a broken dam, quickly spreading to his whole body. In an instant, his whole body was so cold that he felt like he had lost consciousness, making him shiver. But at this time, shivering obviously affected his speed. He suddenly thought of the scene of poisonous snakes sleeping in winter. Were cold-blooded creatures afraid of the cold? His feet could no longer maintain a stable step forward, so he could only control his feet to leave the ground and fly forward with the wings on his back. At this time, he felt the cold gradually attacking his whole body, including his back. Fortunately, the senses on his wings were relatively slow, so he hadn't noticed the cold yet. As the chill spread, Dean saw that the heat on his body was fading rapidly. It was getting weaker and weaker. Finally, only his heart and the area above his neck were still emitting a faint heat. His thoughts suddenly became a little stiff, just like his body that was frozen. A chill crept up his neck, wanting to rush to his head. Dean suddenly had a feeling of panic in his heart. He hurriedly raised his hand to grab his throat, trying to stop the chill in his body. Parna, who was chasing a high speed, was slightly stunned. In his sight, the heat figure running in front of him suddenly declined rapidly. The exuberant heat became weak until it became a little blurred. Finally, it was blocked by the building, and he couldn't see it at all. Although he could track heat, only heat that was strong enough could be seen clearly when it was blocked by other materials. If it was a very weak life, it would be difficult to see if it was blocked by buildings or thick things. What's going on? He was a little surprised. While escaping at full speed, he could still change his own heat. Was this his magic mark ability? Chapter 541. A bit interesting. Parna narrowed his eyes. This speed is completely inconsistent with the body heat. Is it a higher utilization of the body? It also has the ability of insect wings and can control the body heat when moving at full speed. I have never seen such a magic mark ability. Interesting. Whoosh! His figure suddenly sped up, setting off dust everywhere. Dean's face changed when he saw the Wing family youth speed up. He hurriedly waved his wings to speed up, but he felt that his whole body was a bit stiff, as if he would freeze. At the same time, a cold air desperately drilled into his jaw like a viper. He hurriedly clutched his throat tightly, almost unable to breathe. His neck felt like it was about to be broken. Although he didn't know what would happen if the cold air invaded his brain, his intuition told him that he would probably die. He suddenly regretted releasing the cold air in his left hand. At this moment, it was not as easy to suppress it as he thought. It was as if his body was invaded by an angry ice beast. I can't run away. Looking at the bright red figure rapidly approaching, Dean's mind could not help but have this thought, followed by a feeling of despair. He slightly gritted his teeth and dispelled this depressed thought. Suddenly, he thought that his body heat was covered by the active ice blood, so it should be difficult to track him by thermal vision alone. However, the latter was still determined to chase in his direction. Most likely, the Wing family youth had other perception abilities. If I can't see with my eyes, then I have to rely on my hearing and smell. If it's smell, the speed of transmission won't be so fast, so there will inevitably be some hesitation. It should be my hearing. Dean quickly thought. His feet were not touching the ground at the moment, so there was no sound of footsteps. The only sound was the subtle buzzing of the wings and the whistling sound caused by his body breaking through the air pressure. Both of these sounds were very light, which meant that the Wing family youth's hearing nerves were very sensitive. Although he knew this, Dean had a more depressed feeling. Only the sound could not be eliminated. If he stopped here, the Wing family youth would most likely look around and find him sooner or later. 6 kilometers, 5 kilometers. Dean looked at the distance between the two, burning with anxiety. The more anxious he was, the more he couldn't think of any ideas in his mind, and there was no plan in his heart. 3,000 meters, 2,000 meters. Dean looked at the shrinking distance, and his body trembled slightly. Suddenly, he saw the end of the street in front of him, entering a suburb. The concrete residential houses in the suburb were almost completely destroyed. Some were broken, and some were knocked down by unknown things. Behind these residential houses was a dark green mountain, which was connected to the mountain in the previous Shadowhunter's cave. This mountain range seemed to surround the city. If one looked down from the sky, it would look like a huge natural basin. Mountain? Dean was startled to see this. Suddenly, his eyes lit up. He landed on the ground and used his wings to propel himself towards the mountain. His legs were already a little slow, and his senses were numb. However, when he saw the youth of the wing race was getting closer and closer, all he could think about was moving forward. His legs kept moving forward, and his body flew forward like an arrow. His posture was tilted forward almost 90 degrees. If it weren't for the wings on his back, he would have crashed into the ground with such an exaggerated diving posture. 1 kilometer. Dean saw the rapidly shrinking distance. His heart beat wildly. This distance would be overtaken in a few seconds. Whoosh! He used all his strength and once again exerted force on his feet, almost exceeding his limit. His figure dashed out like the wind and finally entered the mountain when the distance between the two was about 600 to 700 meters. As soon as he entered the mountain, Dean roared. His voice was like thunder, rolling and quickly returning, making bursts of echoes. The roar echoed over and over again, and the echoes were continuous. Parna was startled when he heard the sudden roar in front of him. Soon, the echoes came. His face suddenly changed. He looked up at the towering mountain in front of him and suddenly realized, I was wondering why this kid would run to the mountain where the monsters like to live. I thought he wanted to use these monsters to stop me, but he actually relied on the mountain's echoes to interfere with my pursuit? You're quite clever, but you underestimate me too much. Parna slightly raised the corner of his mouth. His ultrasonic hearing was his most trusted perception ability, which was more reliable than thermal vision. After all, some cold-blooded monsters could escape the observation of thermal vision. But ultrasonic hearing was different. He could perceive any monster approaching. Even if the monster was motionless, he could still hear their heartbeat and breathing. If the distance was close enough, he could even hear the sound of blood flowing out of their hearts. He immediately stopped and listened attentively. Soon, in a series of echoes, he heard the extremely slight flutter of wings. His eyes suddenly lit up. He locked on the direction and quickly chased after it. After chasing for hundreds of meters, when he was about to enter the mountain, he suddenly thought of one thing. This kid seems to have mastered my ability? The chuckle on his face suddenly disappeared. His eyes narrowed, and a trace of cold, killing intent flashed through them. Whoosh! Parna quickly drilled into the mountain. Shortly after he entered the mountain, Dean's roar once again sounded in the mountain. Once it sounded, it quickly spread, echoing back and forth. Not enough. Dean was nervous. He flew through the mountain forest. After entering the mountain, his speed was forced to drop. The dense jungle made him need to concentrate at all times, otherwise he would bump into something. Fortunately, his wings were not wide, so he could fly even in the jungle. If it was replaced by the wings of the wing family, it would not work. Monster, monster, come out! Dean looked at the road while looking around for heat sources. At the same time, he was always paying attention to the distance between him and the wing family youth. What made him a little relieved was that after entering the mountain, the speed of the wing family youth pursuit had dropped significantly. Occasionally, the youth would stop, which should be observing his position. After all, when running at full speed, the wind would cover the eardrums and reduce hearing. Moreover, after entering the mountain, the youth's speed dropped, causing the frequency of wing flapping to decrease, and the sound produced was also weakened. He needed to listen more carefully to find the youth's trace under the interference of the echo. Bang! A tree suddenly fell in front of him. Chapter 542. Parnas suddenly heard a subtle, strange sound coming from the opposite direction of Dean's roar. He frowned slightly and looked up at the source of the sound. The corner of his mouth slightly curled up, revealing a sneer. Diversion? That's a good idea, but it's too clumsy. Whoosh! His figure suddenly flickered, leaping through the forest like an ape as he sped away with the wind. In the blink of an eye, Parna's figure appeared in a dense forest, surrounded by strangely colored spotted trees. At this moment, there was a small gap in front of him with a collapsed tree. Under the tree was a dark cave. The cave was not big, about half a meter in diameter. The size of the hidden monster wouldn't be too big. Parna glanced at the cave, and his eyes fell on a huge figure in front of the dense forest. It was a boar-like monster about 3 meters tall, with spikes all over its body. At this moment, it was rushing forward, constantly groaning, and its voice was mixed with a trace of pain. Parna frowned slightly. Did the sound he heard before come from this monster? His eyes were thoughtful. Silence. Dean felt his heartbeat stop. His body was tightly curled up, and his heart was unprecedentedly nervous. He only hoped that time would pass quickly. Parna, who was in contemplation, suddenly froze. A cold light flashed in his eyes. He looked up at the monster that was about to disappear from his sight. His eyes fell on its abdomen, which was slightly bulging as if it had eaten too much. Parna slightly sneered. Insignificant skill. His figure suddenly swept across the dense forest like a rock spreading its wings. The soles of his feet stepped on the trees and leaped forward. In the blink of an eye, he caught up with the monster. Bang! His body landed directly on the back of the monster. The violent shaking of the monster's body during the collision did not cause him to lose his balance at all. He lifted his foot and stomped on the ground. With a thump, the huge monster's limbs suddenly turned soft and it fell to its knees. Its knees hit the mountain soil and it let out a painful howl. Parna quickly bent over and punched the monster's head. His fist burst out a shock force and penetrated the monster's skull. The demonic creature let out a blood-curdling scream on the spot. Its body slowly went limp, and it died. Parna jumped down from the corpse and looked indifferently at the monster corpse at his feet. Come out by yourself. The monster's corpse did not react at all. Parna waited for 10 seconds. Seeing that Dean was still pretending to be dead, he was too lazy to wait any longer. He coldly snorted, seeing that your brain is still smart. I can consider letting you be a spy of our wing family. How about it? Do you want to die, or follow me? The monster's corpse remained motionless at the bulge in its abdomen. Parna's eyes flashed with a trace of anger. He suddenly raised his hand, and a silver light flashed on his fingertips. Poochie! The abdomen of the monster's corpse suddenly split open. The intestines, stomach, liver, and other internal organs slid out along with blood. Among these internal organs, there was a relatively large object covered with blood. It was actually a big stone. Parna was stunned. Rocks. Was that kid hiding in its stomach? He reacted quickly, and a furious killing intent surged in his eyes. He was actually fooled by a stinking brat who was only in his teens. Damn it! He clenched his fists. If he found Dean again, he would tear this kid into pieces. He quickly restrained the anger in his heart, and his thoughts quickly calmed down. His eyes turned, scanning the surrounding jungle. He carefully looked at every tree, grass, and flower. Suddenly, he saw a dent on the ground. The shape of the dent was the same as the big stone in front of him. A picture automatically emerged in his mind. Dean ran here and stuffed this big stone into the monster's body, causing the monster to flee in panic. At the same time, Dean could attract his attention and lead him away. What a cruel and cunning kid. He narrowed his eyes slightly. After looking around, he didn't find any traces, so he closed his eyes gently. The world suddenly became quiet. He lifted his foot and gently stomped on the ground. After a while, he opened his eyes again and flew in another direction. Whoosh! Seeing the youth leave, Dean was secretly relieved. His body was tightly curled up in the sand in the cave. The cold sand corresponded with the bone-chilling blood in his body. He felt like his whole body was frozen. He restrained his body's instinctive shivering and remained motionless in the mud. He didn't go out. Whoosh! A few minutes later, a breeze passed by, and the figure of the youth returned. He turned his head and looked around. He didn't see Dean's figure, so he couldn't help but stomp on the ground. He seemed to be a little angry, and then his body flashed and left again. Dean hid in the sand underground. Although his eyes were closed, his vision could penetrate through his eyelids, and he could see the heat source outside. When he saw the youth leave, he was a little relieved. This time, it was likely that the youth really left. He couldn't hold on anymore. His body slowly trembled, and he slowly crawled out of the mud. He crawled along the exit of the little monster's cave and soon came out of the cave, breathing the fresh air outside the mud. He felt like he was reborn after death. Willing to come out, suddenly a cold voice sounded. Dean's soft, gasping voice suddenly froze. He looked up and saw a figure squatting on a tree next to the cave. It was the youth of the Wing family. He didn't leave? Dean was a little confused. The youth looked at the shock on Dean's face, and the corners of his mouth slightly curled up. There was a kind of happy feeling in his heart, but his expression was indifferent. He said, "You can persist until now. Boy, you're pretty good." Dean looked at him in a daze, and his mind was a little blank. Suddenly, he figured out the reason, and his face suddenly turned ugly. "It seems that you've guessed it." Seeing the change in Dean's expression, the youth's eyes flashed with a trace of surprise. Then he smiled indifferently and said, "You still underestimate me if you want to confuse my hearing. So far, no one has been able to escape from under my eyes." Dean's palms were covered in cold sweat, and his mind was in chaos. He already knew the reason why the youth found him, and that was the echo detection. The youth stomped his feet before, obviously, not because he was angry, but because he used the stomping to transmit the sound to the ground and observe the surroundings through the echo. This ability was usually used on equipment, such as submarines in the old era. However, in this world where non-human warriors were born, he could achieve this step by relying on the strength of the human body. Chapter 543. Seeing that there was no way to escape, Dean's heart slowly calmed down. He simply stood up from the ground and gently moved his body to restore his muscle sensitivity. At the same time, to prevent Parna from attacking immediately, he said, "The Shadow Hunter's parasitic soul worm you want isn't here." Parna looked down at him and indifferently said, I know. Dean looked straight at him and said, If you kill me, it's nothing more than to silence me. I'm just a small dragon guard of the dragon family. Killing me has no impact on the entire dragon family, but if you keep me, I may be of some help to your wing family. Parna looked at his eyes and suddenly curled up the corner of his mouth, saying, I don't need it. Dean was startled. His fingers slightly trembled. He was a little angry and a little nervous at the same time. He took a deep breath and said, I know the secret of the dragon family. I can use this secret to exchange my life with you. Oh. Parna looked at him with a faint smile. Tell me. Dean immediately said, Princess Haley of the dragon family has awakened the power of her bloodline. The dragon family is ready to make her the new saintess. Parna was a little surprised. He looked at him up and down and said with interest, Looking at your appearance, you don't seem to be a member of the dragon family. Where did you get this news? A small dragon guard actually knows such a big secret. Do you think I will believe it? How do you know I'm not a member of the dragon family? Dean changed the topic. The mixed blood members of the dragon family also have black hair, right? Parna chuckled and said, Appearance characteristics naturally can't be accurately judged, but when people of the dragon family talk about the dragon family, they will never say dragon family, but our family. Dean nodded and said, That's true. Tell me. Parna said, If you can't give me a satisfactory answer, I don't have the patience to continue to accompany you with your glib talk. Dean said, The reason is very simple. I'm a spy of the rock family in the dragon family. This news was told to me by my superior. It's absolutely true. A spy of the rock family? Parna was startled. This was beyond his expectation. He didn't expect to meet a spy of the rock race in a random dragon desolate squad that he met by chance. He looked deeply at Dean and suddenly understood. No wonder the boy in front of him was calm and cunning, far beyond the other dragon guards. It turned out that he was a spy who had been rigorously trained. Although this was Dean's one-sided statement, but he somewhat believed it. In addition to Dean's performance, when Dean spoke, he felt that Dean was not lying through thermal vision and ultrasonic hearing. One had to know that when lying, one's heartbeat and body would have an unnatural reaction, and this kind of subtle reaction would not be able to hide from his dual perception abilities. This was also his unique ability to test whether someone was telling the truth or not. So, the spies of your rock race have penetrated quite deeply. The news is even one step ahead of our wing race. Parna deliberately mocked, his face full of disbelief. Dean replied, If you let me live today, then I will pass you the information that we have gathered from the Dragon Clan. Do you think I will believe you? Parna sneered and said, Unless you tell me the positions and names of the other superiors of your rock race in the Dragon Clan, then I will consider it. Dean's heart moved. He didn't know if there were any wing race spies among these superiors. If there were, he could say a few names. If it was the wing race's people, then his lie would naturally be exposed immediately. I only know one. Dean said, It's my superior. He is Princess Hathaway's confidant. As for the others, I don't know. What's his name? Parna stared at him. Dean said without hesitation, Gately. Liar. Parna shouted. Dean was slightly startled, looking at him suspiciously. Seeing Dean's expression, Parna's eyes flashed. He put away the anger on his face and said indifferently, Thank you for telling me this. Rock Race Boy, what's your name? Dean. I will remember this name. Parna smiled at Dean. You're qualified to let me know your name before you die. After that, his figure suddenly moved and jumped down from the tree. Dean's face suddenly changed. He quickly retreated a few steps and looked at him with anger. You don't keep your word? I have already told you this information. If you kill me, it will not do you any good. If you just want to silence me, then it's even more unnecessary. Even if we die, the Dragon Clan will let our corpses speak. They will know that your wing race has invaded the Dragon Clan's territory. That's not important. Parna walked toward Dean step by step, as if he was taking a stroll in the garden. I just want to kill you. Dean was stunned. The anger on his face suddenly disappeared, as if he suddenly took off all the camouflage mask. He looked at Parna with a gloomy face and said, Why? I don't like you. Parna said bluntly. This seemed to be an irrefutable reason. Whoosh! At the same time, Parna suddenly took a step forward, and his figure suddenly disappeared like a phantom. Dean's pupils suddenly shrank to the size of a pinhole, and an afterimage flashed in his oppressive eyes. His retreating body suddenly stopped. He suddenly leaned to the side and swung his hand like a whip, striking forward. Bang! Dean's palm shook violently, and the web between his thumb and forefinger cracked. He retreated 7 or 8 steps, feeling the pain in his wrist as if it was broken. He endured the pain and looked at Parna, who was standing in his original position, staring at his chest. There was a shallow scratch on his dark armor. In front of Parna's feet, there was a dagger. It was the dagger tied to Dean's leg. The corner of Parna's mouth twitched slightly, and his eyes slowly burned with anger. Suddenly, a trace of rejoice flashed in his mind. Fortunately, those guys weren't here. Otherwise, if they saw him killing a frontiersman kid and getting his armor pierced, they would laugh at him for the rest of his life. You really deserve to die. Parna raised his foot and stepped out. The ground slightly sank, and his body suddenly disappeared like a gust of wind. In Dean's contracted pupils, he only saw a shadow that was shallower than before. He hurriedly raised his hand. Whoosh! Suddenly, as he raised his hand, there was a whistling sound between heaven and earth. The shadow in Dean's eyes suddenly stopped, revealing Parna's appearance. He looked up in horror. Seeing Parna's action, Dean couldn't help but look up at the sky. Suddenly, he saw a blood-red light breaking through the sky like a meteor, falling from the sky with a tremendous force, as if to cut off the entire earth. Dean's face was pale. He only felt that his whole body was locked by a huge, murderous intention. It seemed that his body would be torn apart and decomposed in the next moment. Bang! The meteor-like blood light suddenly fell in front of Dean. All of this happened in an instant. Dean only felt a huge shock under his feet, and his body slightly swayed. When he focused his eyes, he was immediately stunned, and at the same time, a strong desire to survive surged in his heart. The falling blood-red light was actually a giant sword that was as red as blood. He had seen this sword before. His eyes burst out with blazing light. Whoosh! At the same time as the sword fell, a slender figure quickly fell from the sky. Both feet stood on the hilt of the sword, standing between Dean and Parna, looking down at Parna. It was Aisha, and this blood-red giant sword was Aisha's exclusive sword, Blood Vessel. You're tuning in to the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.